After a while, the slime abomination finally broke the silence. "Are you happy?" she asked in a tentative manner, causing Eridel to widen his eyes. "Why do you ask?" "I can feel it. I think." Although Eridel had expected it, to hear it voiced that his emotions were now privy to another being was something else. "This is the life now, I suppose." Eridel thought with an odd mixture of emotions. Technically, he could block his emotions from his soulmate if he so wished, something that other soulmate pairs on the planet would be able to do if they became proficient enough. But the feeling of sharing emotions with somebody you could trust, or rather should be able to trust, was a novel experience that he found himself wanting to explore. Either way, he was going to seal her memories, and when he did so he would have to block the entire soulmate link from her end. Having this moment now should be fine. Well, to put it simply, we are each other's other half, soulmates. Eridel didn't mind being a bit truthful now since she would soon lose recollection of the event. What does that mean? She's losing her fear. Eridel thought with interest. He hadn't directly ensured it, but by numerous functions coming into play, soulmates normally had an intrinsic sense of trust for one another. It was a very weightless emotion, but at times, it could influence subconscious thoughts. This, along with her anomaly soul and the many other things she had gained in the last 30 minutes, chaos, gluttony, fourth realm, human form, soulmate bond, must be causing her curiosity to slowly override her fear. For an insignificant moment, Eridel almost replied, "It means that I will always take care of you." A saturated line that he had used many times in the past with various levels of success, mostly positive. But in this context, not only would it have sounded disingenuous, but it would have caused her to remember all the contrary actions he had done to her in the past. Funny though, since this would have been the only time he'd have said the line without it being a complete lie. He opted for a different approach. "It means that we're important to each other. Our souls are tied." Oop, her face squeezed at that. It was quite cute. "Together by fate, and it allows us to sense each other's emotions and enhance each other's powers." "How?" "Why?" she responded with skepticism heavy in her voice. Likely, to her, the concept of the ethereal thing called a soul being tied with another was just too dubious. She had only recently gained a soul, so her knowledge of what they were and what they could do was next to nothing. It wasn't surprising. "I do not quite know. LOL. But that is what the heavens have chosen for us. Forgive me for lying, my dear, but right now, even if I wanted to be truthful, you're a bit too stupid to understand." Eridel thought. "You think I'm a fool, don't you?" the slime abomination asked with slight heat in her voice. "But what you do not know is that I have the memo. I have lived a very long time and I have accumulated knowledge from all over the continent. What you are explaining, this so-called soulmate thing, I have never ever seen it before in my entire life. You really dash." Eridel clicked his fingers and her eyes immediately closed as she fell unconscious. But before she dropped to the ground, he instantly flashed to her side and caught her by her shoulders. How annoying, he thought with amusement. Initially, he had wanted to talk with his soulmate to see how it would feel. After all, this was his soulmate. And unlike his first one, he could actually talk to this one. But clearly, she wasn't ready yet. Their minds were in no way compatible, and if he stayed here, he would have to be answering questions from dawn till dusk. But he wasn't worried in the slightest. This was her after just obtaining a soul, so the fact that they were even able to talk in the first place was already a miracle. Other millennial old bastards who untimely found their soulmates at a young age wouldn't be as lucky as Eridel. Still though, he didn't want to have to keep answering such questions, so he decided to hasten his plans. It was time to take the slime abomination to the human settlement where she would spend the next couple decades or so. But first, Eridel thought as his hands began to glow with a golden light. "I need to place a few seals. Now that I think about it, I can also make that little girl adopt my soulmate so that she can not only give her protection, but also teach her magic. I guess I'll have to make another grimoire then." Central Continent, West Forest, Dragon Mountain. 2 months later, still year 172. At the highest peak of the Dragon Mountain, the peak where the Crystal Dragon King lived, a dragon covered in golden scales peered out of the entrance of the cave and gazed at the starry sky. Obviously, this was not the purple crystal-scaled Dragon King that should have been there. This was Gaia, the only living creation dragon on the planet, and even more impressively, the Iridius world's goddess of creation. Clearly, the Dragon Mountain's highest peak had changed owners. But it wasn't a surprise. All of the dragons on the planet, even the Eastern divine dragons, held this dragon goddess with the highest regard. Even the other races on the continent greatly respected and/or feared her as they gradually understood what it meant to be a god, even if they knew that she was a fallen one. It would have been weirder if she hadn't been gifted the Dragon Mountain's highest peak. Currently, this golden dragon that had raised to such a revered status in such a short time and claimed the pinnacle of the Dragon Mountain was peacefully resting as she revolved the faith energy within her body, converting it into divine energy as she thought about all the things that she witnessed since her revival. To Gaia, this world was nothing short of an aberration. A dreamlike existence that sparsely made any sense. From the very day she had woken up, all kinds of crazy things had begun to reveal themselves one by one. And most of them were actually things that were beneficial to her. For example, she was now a goddess. A goddess that could travel beyond the planet's boundary at that. Sacred lands? The uber-rare treasured territories that the most powerful factions in Segothia had to spend innumerable resources to artificially create, and even more to exclusively occupy? She had seen over 10 of them in just this tiny continent alone, and she hadn't even fully explored it. What was worse was that these sacred lands that were usually owned by the most prestigious gods or ingenious immortals, were being freely occupied by beasts that had never even touched the fifth realm. And she was sure that nobody else outside the continent had reached the fifth realm either. After all, the shackles to the fourth realm and beyond had apparently only been released 45 years ago. That was not enough time for anybody who didn't possess both precious cultivation resources and impeccable cultivation techniques to reach the fifth realm. The fourth realm was a great hallmark to be in, but it was also a depressing one. Cultivating was already hard, even if this world didn't make it seem like that. But after reaching the fourth realm the difficulty increased exponentially. Only the great talents, hardest workers and alchemy chuggers could continue from there. But the seventh realm? Forget it. Too difficult. But not everything about this so-called Iridius world was good. She had come across many daunting things that she was worried about, such as the monster race and the rabid creatures of the sea. There were also locations that she had encountered that she had dared not to tread, even going as far as to ban the entire dragon race from entering. But those things couldn't compare to the threat that she had felt from the 7 beings known as the demon gods, a concept she had never heard of before, beings who were said to be the embodiment of the 7 deadly sins. All those years ago, not too long after that strange man called Eridel had transformed her into a goddess, the entire world had been rocked by the awakening of its first demon god, the sin of envy. It was an absolutely terrifying event and not something that she would easily forget. Of course, she hadn't known what was going on at the time. How could she? But fortunately, thanks to her new status as the goddess of the Iridius world, when she had made her half-hearted attempt for answers from the system, she had actually been obliged. The system had told her of the 7 deadly sins, the 7 demon gods who would eventually rise one by one to rule over the monster race. Unfortunately, when she had asked the system what their purpose was, she had been met with silence. Quite different to the times she had been told that she was unqualified to know. If it had said that, she would have known that at least there was a purpose, she was just not allowed to know it. But now, even though she thought that there was one, she could never confirm it. Ever since then, she had made attempts to collect any information about the sin of envy that she could find, only to meet with failure. The effects of envy's awakening were easy to find, especially since they appeared within her own territory, but news about a being that could possibly be the sin of envy was nowhere to be found. Which meant that he or she was not on this continent. When she had finally reached that conclusion, she had been struck by my multiple feelings. Worry and even a little bit of fear at the fact that despite the sin of envy not even being on the continent, the effects of its awakening still brought up troubles all over the continent. Some joy at the fact that she would not have to be forced to deal with the threat before she had gained adequate strength. And finally, contrary to the last feeling, regret. Regret that she would not be able to deal with the threat before it grew even bigger. 15 years ago, year 157, she had finally gathered enough faith energy to enter the first realm of the divine path, a cultivation system that was on par with the essence path and the anatomy path. Before then, she had been relying on the arduous anatomy path as she slowly gathered faith energy. But now that she was in it, gathering faith energy was multiple times easier than before, and she could now use the energy to form divine energy, something similar to but much greater than mana. The reason it had taken her 30 years to get to that point is because, before she could convert faith energy to divine energy, she needed her divine territory, a small, for now, pocket dimension that would exist with her divine core. But creating such a thing, as one could expect, required enormous amounts of faith energy. So for 30 years, she had been expanding her faith. Making the dragons and other subordinate races pray and create things in her name, two things that gave her faith energy. The divine awakening 15 years ago, which she had renamed Divinity Reclamation so that it would fit into the weaving of lies, was an amazing event. The dragons had adored her and nothing unexpected occurred. Well, the boy called Theodore that she had noticed was tainted by the essence of envy was a bit unexpected since she had been of the mind that she had exposed and gotten rid of all of them, but even that finding was a sign of good luck. Because for some reason, the essence of envy didn't affect the boy's personality too much like it did the others, so she had decided to keep an eye on him instead of exposing him so that she could study the effects of the essence of envy. All in all, her divine awakening was a great success. She had become a true goddess in every sense of the word, unlike the pseudo-goddess that she was before. And with that new status, she had been regretting the fact that she wouldn't be able to deal with the sin of envy. Because now, she was sure that with her own might along with the powerful forces she could rally, the sin of envy, whoever it was, would be able to do nothing but die. But that was nothing but a pipe dream. It was already unrealistic for her to bring her forces to the other side of the continent, talk less of across the seas and into another continent. Her mood grew worse when she remembered that through studying little boy Theo, she had been able to find out that unlike a regular god, a demon god didn't need someone to act upon their sin in their name to reap the benefits. They just had to do it. And whether or not the person wanted it or not, they would form sin essence and a portion of it would go to the sin inheritor. But unlike them, despite the fact that she was the goddess of creation, she couldn't just obtain faith energy from anybody who created things. They needed to create things in her name for her to gain faith energy, and it was completely unfair. Demon gods were clearly a cut above regular gods and it was absolutely daunting. What's worse was that another one had awakened 2 months ago and it was none other than the demon god of gluttony. There were now 2 demon gods in this world. If before, the situation could be called dangerous, now it was critical. Gaia could already imagine that it would take more than a few average gods to deal with a single demon god, but the only god she knew of was none other than herself. Thankfully, her divinity was nothing to scoff at. Creation was omnipresent and was not something that could be avoided. Being the goddess of creation, if she played her cards right, she would be able to get the entire world to revere her, making the gap between her and the demon gods diminish greatly. However, that was too hard of a project and would take a lot of time. And even in the situation that she did accomplish that, wouldn't there be more demon gods by that time? If there were still only 2 at that time, perhaps she could overcome them using other techniques from her past life. After all, she wasn't just a goddess, she was also an ex-immortal that had lived thousands of years. That meant that there were many things that she would be able to use in this life to grant herself a greater advantage, with fighting experience being the least of it. In comparison to that, even though it was clear that the demon gods possessed a lot of raw might, there were things that an old soul like hers would be able to do that small children like them wouldn't be able to do. But 3, 4, or more demon gods. She would definitely die even if she rallied the help of the entire continent. Perhaps she was wrong. All of her ideas of their strength came from mere speculation and not concrete fact. She hadn't even seen a single one of them yet, talk less of their fighting prowess. But then again, perhaps the situation was even more lethal than she was guessing it to be. Gaia sighed. It had been a long time since she had had to worry so much for her future. When she had become an immortal, although it was a whole new playing field with even more dangerous enemies, retaining her life or even avoiding all kinds of hostility altogether became much easier. She had been able to leave the world. Back then, if she had aggravated someone she wasn't able to deal with, she could have just fled to another planet. Although Segothia was her home, the place her heart resonated with the most of the time, she wasn't even in the desolate region. She would either be in the Mithril region since it was not only the safest location but also the best in terms of commerce, or the Dragoria region. The latter was because there was a really powerful man there who had hoped to win her heart. He had always managed to protect her and shower her with resources without expecting anything back, and had never gotten mad at her. Honestly, if she hadn't found out about the other hundreds of women that he gave the same treatment to, she would have given her body and heart to him long ago. Besides that, she also sometimes traveled to other regions, but never ever to the unhallowed region. For obvious reasons, if she offended a big player there, even one weaker than her, that region would become her final resting place. It was for that same reason that she had only visited the Kong Eternal region once. The place was really amazing and quite welcoming, but sometimes they were a bit too welcoming. If a single arrogant young master decided that he wanted her, she would never be able to leave the Kong Eternal region ever again. There were numerous stories of female immortals from other regions being forced to marry into the Kong Eternal region after a single visit. Not that they were all unwilling, but it was still true. There had even been a case of an evil goddess, World Sinner, being forced to marry a young master from the Kong family's main branch. That had been quite the shock all over the galaxy. Luckily, when Gaia had visited there, she had been able to mask herself using a special technique and got what she went there for without encountering a single big player that would have seen through the facade, and left very swiftly. In and out, very simple. Since then, she had never tested her luck again. Thinking about her old life, Gaia sighed once more and then shook her head. She needed to focus on the now. Closing her eyes, she resumed her faith energy to divine energy conversion. West Continent, Central Lands, Heavenly Sun Domain. At the peak of a luscious mountain filled with various verdant life, a gigantic golden flame that was 30 meters tall peacefully floated in the middle with majestic luster. This was, of course, the Heavenly Sun Flame. The very same Heavenly Sun Flame that had caused this same mountain to become a wasteland filled with nothing but ash 45 years ago. But obviously, things had changed. For one, this mountain was no longer a land of ash and was now filled with golden grass, trees packed with golden leaves, bountiful magic herbs and more. No doubt the most beautiful of them all were the trees. Not only were they pristine and gorgeous, but they also rained down tiny embers that looked like golden snow. Clearly, this land had become a sacred land because of the Heavenly Sun's existence. And speaking of the Heavenly Sun, its size had also increased by quite a bit. Before it was only 10 meters tall, but now it floated at 30 meters tall, proving that it had increased in power just like the sacred volcano had. Siphon essence, skill was indeed a great one. But that was by far not the extent of the changes around here. She-ear. The majestic cry of a legendary bird sounded. Swooping down from the sky came a giant bird that had a wingspan of 160 meters. It looked quite similar to an eagle, only, it was multiple times more domineering and was far more elegantly shaped. Furthermore, its feathers were completely white with an undertone of gold, and they were alight with golden-colored flames. Lastly, it had two eyes that were similar to Leanda's, completely gold and blazing, but it also had a third eye on its forehead that was very similar to Yorma's eye of petrification, but instead of red, it was a pale blue. It too carried the distinct impression of flames. Without a doubt, this was a very interesting figure. Other figures that were clearly of the same species were following it from a distance. However, not only were they much smaller, but their feathers, although similarly alight with golden flames, were only pure white in color and had no golden undertones. Neither of them had a third eye either, and their two regular eyes, which were also gold, still retained a normal white sclera and bold black pupils. Looking at all of these birds, it didn't take much to guess that the Heavenly Sun had adopted a new species. The giant bird finally landed not too far from the Heavenly Sun and bowed down to it immediately, keeping its head down in a show of subservience for a whole 5 minutes before standing up tall again. Looking at it now, not only did it have a large wingspan which only a legendary bird like the phoenixes and the purgatory vermilion birds had when they entered the fourth realm, but it also had a respectable height of 56 meters. This bird was completely awe-inspiring. But somebody seemed to disagree. "Hey, Eagle. Now that you've finished acknowledging the Lord, get out of my way. You're blocking my sight," a bold female voice spoke, not a single ounce of awe or respect to be found. The giant bird twisted its head to gaze at the tiny female to its side. In the next moment, it suddenly began to transform without warning, rapidly shrinking in size until what remained was a 2.2-meter tall male human. But of course it wasn't a human. And if the fact that the man had just transformed wasn't a dead giveaway, then surely the flaming white feathered wings that were protruding from his back was. In this form, the bird now man had long white hair that had golden undertones just like his feathers, and he was incredibly handsome. But other than the wings, the man's only other beast-like feature was the talons that replaced a normal human's nails. Of course, the third eye was still there, but considering the fact that it was very obviously an evil eye, calling it beast-like feature was a bit inappropriate. Right now, all three of those eyes were narrowed as he focused his attention on the female human before him. She had long wild golden hair that tumbled to her ankles, a delicious figure that could entice any man, and blazing eyes that were completely golden. She gave off the demeanor of an unruly and domineering woman, but this coupled with the pure seduction of her body only caused one to want to subdue her and possess her. "Leanda. How many times must I tell you not to call me that?" the man said with a deceptively cold voice as he advanced towards the girl, stepping so close until they could feel each other's breath. Well, I just said it. What are you going to do about it? Leander replied without a hint of fear as she stared into the man's eyes that were just like her own, minus the third one. The man raised up his hand and caressed the woman's cheek in a slow, sensuous manner. It looked like a loving move, but in just a single second a bead of blood had appeared and was now trickling down her face. The man hummed as he watched the blood drop off of her chin. If you were anyone else, I would have already eaten you, he said bluntly. Then he dropped his hand and backed off. But of course I won't. Leanda suddenly smirked. Wow, the little eagle that I saved that day has become so bold. Whatever will I do? Golden Rock, Leanda. Golden Rock. I am no longer an eagle and have risen far, far above my past self. At least acknowledge that. The man responded, indifferent to the girl's apparent amusement. Sure, Pharaoh. Sure, Leanda said flippantly. But then her face suddenly became serious. So, how did it go? Hearing her question, Pharaoh closed his eyes and sighed before seeming to gather himself again. I had to kill a few of them to make them take me seriously, Leanda's face tensed. But eventually, I did get to meet the Phoenix King. And as could be expected, he was quite furious with what I had done and almost attacked me. Leanda's frown grew. But, when I explained myself and my reason for coming, he directly punished those trashy guards of his without hesitation. It was quite amusing, Pharaoh said with a smirk, the first show of emotion since he had arrived. But it slipped away in the next moment. Anyhow, the arrogant king actually agreed. As a matter of fact, he even took me to meet the Nine-Flame Queen, and both of them have agreed to help when the time comes. What's more is that they both spoke of gaining help from other continents, something we had not thought of before. Leanda's already luminous eyes brightened further. Wonderful! I was still worried before, even after knowing that the two other rulers of this continent were likely to aid us. After all, if what that duck said was to be true, the being known as Envy has already conquered an entire continent with his army, and he's only going to get more powerful. If he's truly set sight on our continent like the duck said, then we are really in deep trouble. Leanda said. Though, I'm surprised at how easy it was for the Phoenix King and the 9 Vermilion Bird to agree to help us. Did they not doubt you at all? Pharaoh shook his head. A little bit. The Phoenix King only asked me for Envy's appearance and I told him what the duck told us. From then on he believed me completely. Then he seemed to realize something. Hey, do you reckon they know each other? They're both phoenixes after all. It's very likely, Leanda said absent-mindedly, then she shook her head. In any case, all we can do now is continue to raise our strength. Whether we gain extra help or not is up to the other two rulers. Right? Pharaoh said and then turned to look at the heavenly sun flame. I will do anything to protect my lord, even if I have to ignite this eye of cremation and blow myself up to do it. He then turned back to look at Leanda, who was staring back at him. All of their eyes burning with zeal. East Continent, Yoloria Empire, City of Glory. The High Human Empress, or rather Gloria, peacefully sat on her throne with her cheek resting on her closed fist. But she was not the Gloria of before. Her appearance had changed drastically. Her long golden silky hair had been replaced by tendrils of light, her irises had been replaced by orbs of light, her skin had actually become paler but was even more enchanting than before, her bust and hips had become more alluring and her visage even more so. She was positively stunning, and that was somehow even more pronounced with her increased height that reached 191 centimeters. A whole 11 centimeters taller. Sitting naked on the throne the way she was the perfect picture of gentle serenity and noble beauty. However, that was a complete deception. In contrast to the peaceful state of her appearance, hundreds of thoughts were passing through her mind like it was nothing. And not a single thing showed on her face. Clearly, her already aberrant brain had definitely moved, more so than what the increment of essence cultivation could provide. But how? Well, if not because of the obvious anatomy refinement she had been practicing, what else could it be? Somehow, the High Human Empress had not only discovered anatomy refinement, but she had also created her own special technique. Normal essence cultivation would very rarely ever change someone's appearance so greatly, talk less of replacing one's natural hair with something as ethereal as light. Just like there were essence cultivation techniques, there were also anatomy refinement techniques that one could use just by sitting down and revolving their energy. Each technique still caused huge amounts of pain, but at least you could stop it before death whenever you wanted, unlike Reiko, who was always testing how much death was repulsed by him. The more special techniques could do things like what had occurred to Gloria, which was to not only make a body more perfect, but also forcefully increase the body's attunement with a certain element to the point that it caused outward changes. Of course, such a feat was actually incredibly difficult and hard to accomplish, but since Gloria was a first-generational being, every part of her body was incredibly malleable, making it much easier for mutations and the like to occur. It was quite shocking that someone who was only 172 years old had created a technique like this without any guidance or inheritances, but thinking about the ridiculousness that was her intelligence, it could be said that something like this was only a matter of time. Her first experiences with anatomy refinement had only increased the pace. As she sat on the throne with such accolades practically radiating from her pores, one couldn't help but think that she looked like the perfect empress. Only her personality was left questionable. How had it changed after all this time? Knock knock knock. Come in. Gloria's melodious voice sounded. That too had improved. A pair of large doors 40 meters in front of her opened as two people made their way in. One of them was a tall male with blonde hair and aquamarine eyes, and the other was a similarly sized female with brunette hair and silver eyes. Of course, as high humans they were both very attractive, but in front of the Empress it was relegated to nothing. The two of them then walked forwards in an orderly manner, both of them in sync like they had practiced it many times before, and then they took a knee 5 meters away from the Empress. Her blinding eyes boring into them like intangible weights. Your Majesty, they said at the same time. Clearly, the high humans had been advancing their culture. For a moment, the Empress remained silent as she stared at the people kneeling before her, only responding 30 seconds later when sweat had begun to seep out of their skin. What is the matter? Her voice autocratic and strong yet soothing and charming. Reporting to your Majesty, we have received news from the southern border that a new species has been spotted, said the female with brown hair and gray eyes. A new species? The Empress questioned, the slight dizziness bleeding out of her posture as she straightened up and rested her elbows on the armrests of her throne. What kind? According to the Alphonse King, they are not beasts or even monsters, your Majesty. They look just like us, replied the female. The Empress' eyes brightened even further. I assume the Alphonse King isn't foolish enough to mistake a group of enlightened beasts for an actual new species. Well, not that enlightened beasts are so quantifiable that a group of them could actually form in one place. Quickly, explain their appearances to me. This time the male with blonde hair and aquamarine eyes responded. Apparently they appear perfectly humanoid like us high humans, only they are slightly shorter on average, have very pale white skin, red eyes, sharp nails and sharp teeth. Only their hair seems to possess a more diverse capacity. Oh? Quite beast-like. I would be slightly worried if it weren't for the fact that the Alphonse King lived to tell the tale. The Empress said with a small smile as she thought about the boy she had raised into a capable man. A new species that looks like us. Although I had always expected another enlightened race to exist, it is still a little stifling to think about. To think that one would suddenly appear on this continent. What is their strength like? The Empress continued. The Alphonse King said that they would always swiftly retreat when approached and would never fight, thus he has no idea of their strength. However, he has said that they possess a very vicious and bloodthirsty aura that even surpasses that of the creatures in the Burning Nines, and that they are definitely evil and we should prepare for their attack. At that, the Empress stood up from her throne, every one of her movements smooth and graceful. But her eyes were like twin suns as she stared at her two subjects. Did anybody manage to learn the name of their species? She asked, her voice even more imposing than before. Blood fiends, your Majesty. They are called blood fiends. Blood fiends? That's right, your Majesty. The female responded. What a malicious name. The Empress said as she began to walk forward. I'm going to the Alphonse Kingdom. Gather some others and look after the palace. Yes, your Majesty. 2 steps later, the Empress disintegrated into motes of light that flew in all directions before vanishing. East Continent, Yoloria Empire, Alphonse City. Placed directly in the middle of the Alphonse City was a giant castle made of rock, wood and a few pieces of metal. This was the palace belonging to the ruler of this small city, Victor Alphonse, otherwise known as the Alphonse King, titled after the Alphonse forest that he and his small band of trusted knights had conquered alone 32 years ago. Not only is he a peak talent, but he is also a first-generation graduate of the Zenith Academy and could be considered half a son to the Empress. Of all the first-generation graduates, he along with 8 other people were chosen by the Empress to be the kings and queens of the 9 other cities outside of the City of Glory. It was this very man that was exiting the palace with haste as 7 other individuals followed him a few steps behind. Every one of them carried sharp weapons that looked like they were made from both rock and metal and possessed strong glares that spoke of tough characters. Going by the way they were all acting, it was apparent to everyone else that they meant business, so they all got out of the way with smiles, unlike other times where they might have tried to greet their king or his special band of knights. However, before the Alphonse king could get very far, a zap sound was heard and a woman made of golden light materialized not too far away from him. Who else could it be other than the Empress herself, Gloria? Victor was already smiling when the light faded away and revealed the unparalleled beauty that was His Majesty. Not a second later, every pedestrian in the vicinity had prostrated themselves, whereas the king and his 7 knights took a knee. "We welcome your Majesty," they all yelled. And then the Empress made a small sound of acknowledgement. Then she turned her brilliant eyes towards her citizens and said, "You may leave." They all stood up with sheer awe on their faces, gave a quick 9-0 bow and then scurried off to different locations in silence. But not too long after, sounds of amazement and jubilant conversation could be heard as the citizens reached a distance where they thought that the Empress would no longer be able to hear them. Of course, they were wrong. But the Empress inwardly smiled at the thought of them not wishing to disturb her. It was not something she had ever ordered them to do, outside of unique situations, so it was quite heartwarming. "Victor," she said out loud as she focused on the man. "Yes, Your Majesty." His voice was firm and steady, but the smile that he was trying to suppress was not going away at all. "It's good to see you after 5 years," she said as she revealed a small smile. But whilst the smile was minute, Victor felt like he had found a peerless treasure. "I feel the same, Your Majesty." His voice trembling with emotion. Each and every one of the Empress's smiles were like gold that could only be found with luck or relentless pursuit. But her smile was much more beautiful than gold. Victor temporarily felt like he had committed blasphemy by comparing the Empress's smile to mere gold. However, before he could begin to construct grand poems about the Empress's beauty, grace, magnanimity, power, intelligence, talent, peerlessness, majesty and more, the Empress spoke once more. "Whilst I would like to catch up with you, I am here for a different purpose. Come, take me to where you last saw the blood fiends." Victor was temporarily dumbstruck. But then he realized what was going on in the next moment and began to speak. "Central Continent, Forest of Dawn, Glacial St. Deer Clan territory." In the northern region of the Forest of Dawn was a paradise that was only accessible to herbivores that refused to hunt other life forms for supplement, and this territory was owned by the Glacial St. Deer Clan, or to be more specific, their progenitor, Dodo, the guardian of the Dawn Forest. He was a powerful elk that had unknowingly formed an apostle contract with Sierra when she had first formed, but because Sierra was an anomaly that had no limiters like the other anomalies did, the benefits Dodo had gained from the apostle contract were so much more stupefying. It was so much so that for the next 50 or so years, he had been the undisputed strongest life form on the planet. But obviously that was no longer the case. Driven by unholy lust that contrasted his holy-looking appearance, he had decided to stall his cultivation and focus on enhancing the cultivation of other deer-type beasts in the hopes that sooner rather than later, they would reach a size he could safely fornicate with. The result was the St. Beast Deer Clan. However, even if he had been diligently cultivating all this time, he still would have lost his position as number 1 under the heavens. Over time, the Iridius world had given birth to a lot more aberrant beings and Dodo just didn't have the qualifications to compete. Well, not that he cared. His life was filled with endless peace. Who cared about fighting? He had all the beautiful respectable deers that he wanted. And even though he was duty-bound to protect Sierra, his great benefactor, who by the way, he loved very much, there was not a single time in history where she had suffered any form of assault. Though, he would like to rough up her heavenly father if he could, that bastard has disappeared off somewhere for over 100 years, ignoring all the times the girl had cried out her heart for him. R18 warning. This chapter is filled with sexual content and viewers' discretion is advised. But come now, you know what kind of novel you picked up. There has always been an R18 tag and that has never been hidden. So for that reason, this will be the first and the last time you see a R18 warning before the action happens. Next time it will just happen. Underscore 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 underscore. In the middle of a small clearing surrounded by trees that had leaves that looked like they were made from ice, there was a rather large pile of soft-looking bluish-white bushes in the center. And casually laying on those bushes were 4 enchanting figures that looked like they had descended from the high heavens. 3 of them were female, but the last was male. The male's was, of course, Dodo. He had long white hair, luminous but pale blue eyes, a pair of antlers on his forehead that were made of ice, a perfect 2-meter-tall physique and pale skin. Currently, he was gazing up at the sky through the minuscule gap that the clearing provided, thinking about the day before when he had gone to visit Sierra, only to find her crying. TCH, Dodo inwardly tooted as his mood soured. Go check out your daughter, you heavenly bastard. He let out a sigh but ultimately didn't do anything. He didn't even dare to speak the words out loud lest he find himself dead. Even till this day, he still remembered the pressure he had felt from the powerful but invisible being that had been there when he had become the guardian of the forest. To be honest, he didn't really know who or even what Sierra's father was, but every one of his instincts told him that he, or it, was something completely beyond his scope of understanding. He let out another sigh. However, before his mood could descend even further, he heard a scuffling sound that indicated that one of his wives, a concept he had learnt from the Elven Queen, had woken up and was now moving. But just as he was about to lift up his head to see which of the 3 it was, he felt a zing of pleasure erupting from his crotch as something wet and soft slithered across its surface. NNGH, he grunted a little and closed his eyes as he let his head fall back to the bush. Feeling better, my lord? A bewitching voice asked, and then he felt the same sensation occur once more. Ah, so it's Chica. Dodo thought as he felt loving emotions rise in his heart. Chica was an oceanic cheetal deer and the only one left of her kind in this forest. Compared to his other 2 wives, she was definitely the smallest, and that wasn't because of her cultivation either. But when it came to things like this, her heart was definitely the biggest. A feeling of wet softness engulfed his rod and he let out another moan of pleasure. But this time he had better control over his bearings and reached out a hand to caress her head. I'm feeling much better already, Chica. The girl must have heard him sigh and decided to make him feel better. When did you wake up? Not long ago, my lord. Mama, what is bothering you? Tell your Chica. Chica spoke, taking a break to devour his rod in between. And as pleasure coursed through his veins once more, Dodo couldn't help but sigh once more, but this time it was one of happiness. Ah! I'm so glad that we discovered this special technique. Dodo thought, proud of his supreme unparalleled intellect. Ever since he had discovered that sexual pleasure didn't always have to come from directly mating, it had opened up a new world for him and his many mates. It had begun when an innocent leg had brushed against his morning wood, the day after his first night sleeping in his enlightened form, causing a surprising yet familiar pleasure. And when he had spoken about this with his mates, they had been open to the idea of exploring what this might have meant. Ever since then, they had all developed these special techniques to pleasure one another through trial and error. However, only his 3 wives were deserving of his own special techniques, the others were only there to increase his progeny or pleasure him when his wives weren't available. My lord, came her voice again. Ah, she asked me a question. Dodo thought. Sorry. You are just too good at this and caused me to forget myself. Dodo wittily replied. You don't need to worry too much. I was just thinking about poor Sierra. Ah, Chica let out a small sound. Suddenly, Dodo felt delicate hands grip onto his biceps, followed by the blood-boiling sensation of a curvaceous body sliding up his own. And in the next moment, the gorgeous face of Chica appeared above him like a rising sun. She had long sky-blue hair, unblemished white skin, dark blue enchanting eyes and same-colored antlers, a height of 1.7 m tall and a relatively flat chest. But even though her chest paled in comparison to his other 2 wives, her slim waist, wide hips and shapely legs had no equal. She was truly beautiful. After seating herself on his lap and adjusting herself into a position that allowed his rod to nestle itself in between her butt cheeks, she brought up her hands to his face and held it delicately but steadily, showcasing a rare sign of dominance as she stared unwaveringly into his own eyes. However, the smile that graced her lips was soft, endearing and filled with endless love, so much so that it rendered him unable to look away. My lord is indeed kind, Chica began as she caressed his cheeks. But I'm sure there's nothing to worry about. Sierra is a very strong girl and will surely either come to terms with her current situation or find a substitute that will love and cherish her, just like you do me. Her smile then became a little wicked and she rolled her hips so that both of their sexes rubbed against each other, causing both of them to moan with pleasure. Then she lowered her upper body to his chest, allowing him to feel her pebbled nipples and silky hair, before whispering into his ear in her most enticing voice yet. Please, my lord. Show me your love. Underscore 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 underscore. Attention. I am aware that some people might be upset about the fact that a side character is getting his own scene before the MC, so I am here to say. What are you going to do about it? Ha 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 ha. You peasants, I'm the king. I can do whatever I want. Ha 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 ha. Ahem, I'd also like to say, don't worry. Eridel's time will come. Please, my lord. Show me your love. Dodo felt his body positively vibrate with vigor as he heard the enthralling words. And thus, not willing to wait a second longer, he pulled himself up along with Chica using his core muscles with effortless ease, so that they were now face to face and passionately staring at each other, and then lifted her by her small waist before dropping her back down on his rod. And he wasn't gentle about it either. Aya! Chica let out a long heavenly moan as Dodo began pistoning into her like his life depended on it, but it didn't take long before he switched their positions one more time and he was now driving into her from above with a force that might have injured normal women, but clearly, if the noises she was making were anything to go by, she loved every bit of it. However, because of the careless noises that they were both making, it didn't come as a surprise when extra body parts began to rub themselves all over Dodo's body. Enticingly wet tongues, incomparably smooth hands, the unmistakable bouncy softness of delectable breasts. This is the life. Dodo inwardly yelled as he shoved himself as deep as he could inside of Chica and then deposited his fluids without abandon. His roar mixed with her own keening moan as her snatch strongly gripped his rod, signifying her own release and enhancing his own. The perfect rhythm that he was so proud of was destroyed and his hips couldn't stop bucking as pleasure racked his nerves. But such was always the case when his wives were involved. After releasing everything into her womb, he dropped down to Chica's chest in contentment and decided to temporarily wind down and enjoy the caresses of his wives, even if he could already go for another round. More than the lust of his wives, he desired their love and liked to soak in it at any given moment. However, 30 seconds later, a deeper but equally seductive voice called out to him. Dodo, you're not tired, are you? Ah, Freya. Dodo immediately recognized the voice and a smile spread across his face. He rolled off of Chica and sat up so that he could see all of his wives. Other than Chica, there were two other transcendental women that were looking at him with smiles that held their own unique emotions for him. Sitting on his right, next to Chica, was Lumi. She had long curly white hair, shimmering silver eyes, stone-gray antlers, pale skin and a golden ratio body. She was a genius reindeer with an affinity for the wind element and was the second love of his life. But it was not her that had spoken. Sitting on his left was a very eye-catching woman, and when one looked at her, the first thing on their mind would always be big. And that was because of her dynamic proportions. First of all was her height. She was tall, even taller than him with her 2.3 m height. She had long black hair that fell to her calves, black jewel-like eyes, huge wing-shaped antlers that looked like they were carved from black crystals, dark skin that was rare in this part of the forest, and body dimensions so explosive that they jiggled with every movement. Her breasts, buttocks and thighs were absolutely unrivaled. Chica may have better-shaped legs, but her thighs lacked the thickness of Freya's. Freya was a moose and had an affinity for metal. But not any ordinary sort of metal. A long time ago, she had found a special ore called zinnion. It was black, very reflective, and at first glance even looked a little fragile. But that was utter deception. Till this day, Dodo had never encountered a heavier ore again. Even the Iridius system had stated that its unique factors were its exponential weight and sturdiness. By now, Dodo had realized that everything attached to the planet was incredibly hard. Even a common tree or bush on the ground. However, if a part of it naturally, or through Herculean influence, broke off of the main body, like the branch of a tree, it would gradually lose its worldly protection and eventually become much more normal. This was why he was easily able to agree when the Iridia system had said that Xinian was much sturdier than most objects. Stones, common ores and the like could not compare at all. Freya had managed to comprehend the essence of Xinian and was all the more powerful for it. It was also thanks to this connection that she was so big. Of course, as a moose, the biggest type of deer, she was already destined to be big. But the Xinian metal affinity made her even bigger. And also much heavier. But luckily, with his strength, her weight was nothing to him and he was able to play with her body as he pleased. Me? Tired? Dodo shot out his right arm to grab the girl by her arm and then threw her to their makeshift bed. He ignored the heavy thump sound that sounded like a giant boulder had just dropped, and then turned to Lumi and threw her down too, drawing a joyous squeal from the girl. If I don't breed the lot of you until you all pass out, I am not Dodo, the guardian of this entire forest. The next few hours were filled with pleasurable moans as Dodo made do on his promise. As mentioned earlier, because of Eridel's purposeful intentions, unique features that are only accessible to one side of a species gender, e.g., lion manes, deer antlers and the like, are actually now accessible to the other gender. However, they look different and could be recognized as feminine or masculine almost immediately. NNNGH. Dodo groaned out loudly as he let out a final load deep into Freya's womb. The girl herself was seemingly roaring but not a single sound came out of her mouth. Her face twisted in rapture clearly showcased everything she was feeling, so it didn't come as a surprise, but it was truly a thing to behold when a few seconds later, her eyes rolled back and she passed out. To make a girl with such a tough constitution pass out with pleasure was impressive. Even more so when you realized that she was the last of Dodo's wives to do so, meaning that even after spending effort to finish off the other two, he had still been able to do the same to Freya. Truly remarkable. The man in question didn't even seem all that fazed. He merely switched to a crossed-legged sitting position and then stretched his arms above his head with a contented sigh. My wives are undoubtedly the best female creatures ever created, he thought with smug pride. If anyone were to ever touch them, a dangerous light flashed across his eyes as thoughts of violence uncharacteristic for a peaceful elk filled his mind. But then all of a sudden, they sparked with a different light. Right, before I forget, he turned his attention to the ground around his makeshift bed. There was a giant sheet of ice covered in protruding icicles of varying sizes. They glowed with a profound light and just a single glance was enough for Dodo to gain a bit of comprehension on the mysteries of the water/ice laws. But it wasn't just that. Accompanying the spires of ice were black shards of metal that looked like Xinian. But it wasn't Xinian. Thanks to past experience, Dodo didn't need to investigate to already know that they were inferior copies. However, unlike real Xinian, this inferior copy was exuding the same strange light that the ice was releasing, and as one could guess, studying it would provide remarkable success in the comprehension of metal laws. Dodo quickly closed his eyes and began to focus on the laws of water/ice as he had done many times before. For some reason, whenever he started mating with his three wives, if they began to go all out, they would begin emit the laws of their specific elements, and if they did it long enough, it would begin to alter reality and create these special domains that aided their comprehension of the laws exponentially. On top of that, in this state, whenever they climaxed, they would release a special energy inside of their fluids that the other would be able to absorb. And it was such a miraculous energy that it boosted all three aspects of their beings, body, soul and essence. He didn't know why such a thing only occurred with his wives and not his other mates, but he simply attributed it to them being special. Whatever the case, it was not something that he could change. He had already tried multiple times, hoping that the phenomenon would boost all of their powers, but he was met with failure each and every time. Well, it didn't matter much. According to his knowledge, no one else was receiving such abnormal benefits, and even if there were, they were definitely in the minority, so he didn't mind the fact that his regular mates had to train just like anybody else. Dodo briefly opened his eyes to look at his three wives. Normally, when he had finished breeding them, all four of them would use this time to comprehend their respective laws using the strange domains. But talk less of the fact that Chica's and Lumi's domains had already disappeared with time, none of them were even awake to enjoy it even if it hadn't. He serves them right for provoking this saint, Dodo thought shamelessly with a wide grin. However, he soon resumed focus and gathered his hands to the center of his crossed legs. Meditation was another thing that he had learnt from the elves. Its overall effects weren't all that beneficial to him since he was almost in perfect control of his mind and didn't need any special positions or breathing patterns to help him reach a state of enlightenment, but it did slightly improve the circulation of mana in his mana circuits, and as such, it was something he liked to do whenever he was cultivating. Like this, he continued to simultaneously absorb the special energy of his wife's fluids and comprehend the laws of water/ice. The domain would be disappearing within 20 to 30 minutes and he intended to capitalize on every single second of it. Or so he thought. A mere 2 minutes later, his senses discovered something that caused his expression to greatly change. Standing at the edge of his clearing and looking at him with an imperious gaze was a female elf. She was, without a doubt, the most objectively beautiful female he had ever seen. Visage, body, demeanor, everything was on point. However, recognizing her identity immediately, he didn't dare to profane her even in his thoughts and revealed a surprised smile. "Titania," he called out with half joy, half confusion. Yes, standing not too far away from him was the Elven Queen herself, Titania. Her appearance hadn't changed much over the years, she still had her untainted pure white long hair, star-like eyes and green skin. Actually, she was quite a few times more beautiful than the image of the queen she had been when they had first met. The reason it was put like that was because he had been a regular elk back then and had zero attraction for humanoids. But the clothing she was wearing was vastly different to their prototype. It had started with mere sheets of cloth that would wrap around the body and cover the so-called private areas. Back when they had first been invented, he had only felt slight disdain for them. But now, looking at the immaculate design of white, green and gold that hugged her curves, he couldn't help but feel a little stunned. What he had once considered useless and even a little annoying, was now something that was enhancing the Elven Queen's beauty by at least a fold. "I must obtain some for my wives," he thought with great seriousness. But truly, even without those clothes, the Elven Queen is definitely the most beautiful woman of all. He truly thought that. But although he thought that, he didn't really feel it. In his mind, nobody could compare to his 3 wives. Their noses may not be as chiseled, their cheekbones not as high and their lips not as bow-like, but for some reason, it was these slight deficiencies that made them perfect to him. To be honest, the Elven Queen could be considered too beautiful. He wouldn't deny that he lusted for her at times, but for the most part, he thought of her as a great friend and actively tried not to think of her in that way. And even if he didn't, the lust he felt for her was nothing compared to the near-ironically burning desire he felt for his wives. Shaking his head, he spoke once more. "It's been far too long, Titania. What brings you here?" Although they were great friends, the last time they had seen each other was 5 years ago, year 167, and that was only because the elves had suffered a brutal rebellion that had damaged their foundations, and he felt compelled to give out a helping hand. If not for that, the time that they had spent apart would have been much greater. It's not that they didn't like to see each other, they did. It's just that as rulers who had so many people to look after, they were always busy. They had to commit to increasing the power of themselves and their people, and it didn't help much that they were half competing with each other. They were allies, but their races were too different to be perfectly friendly. Even if they were great friends, best friends even, it wasn't possible to convince their respective races to emulate that. Beasts couldn't even talk to other races unless they were in the seeking beast realm, third realm, and elves were too obsessed with beauty, grace and controlled power, causing them to treat beasts with disdain. It was already a miracle that they treated his own people nicely. He had seen how they treated the beasts in Emperor Reiko and Dragon King Draco's territories when they had the strength advantage. But that was none of his concern. He was far more interested in why the Elven Queen had personally come here to speak to him. It had to be something important. Normally, they would send a messenger beforehand to either request a visit to the other's territory or request the other to visit their territory. This prevented any misunderstandings and allowed each other to prepare for the event. But clearly, Titania didn't want to waste any time. Either that or what she wanted to say was extremely important and not something she wanted to disclose to a mere messenger. "I come with daunting news. But first, I must express that it's good to see you after all this time, Dodo. How do you fare?" Hearing her voice, Dodo's eyes widened slightly. Something about her voice had changed. Before, it was always beautiful to hear, but now it was positively enchanting. And he wasn't saying that as a flowery description. Although what he knew about the soul was next to nothing, he felt like, if he was a weaker being, her voice might have addled his mind, perhaps even compelled it. How could this be? "Your voice," he spoke out with an obvious question in his tone. If it was someone else, he wouldn't have acted this way. That would portray his ignorance and give the other person a slight upper hand, and all for nothing since they would either deny him or outright lie. But with Titania, such worries were irrelevant. Ah, I forgot since it's been a while now. Actually, I experienced a fortuitous encounter some years ago and comprehended a bit of the laws of sound because of it. Not bad, right? She responded with a cheeky grin at the end. Truly? Dodo asked in shock. Truly. Titania nodded with a trace of pride. Wow, Dodo slowly shook his head in wonder. As expected of you, to be honest. Titania smiled. Comprehending new laws was difficult. Really difficult. Dodo was a first-generation genius that had lived for 172 years and still, he had not comprehended a single law other than the ones that were gifted to him by Sierra, life and water/ice. And although a big part of that was because he had no predecessors or scriptures to learn from, it still showed how Herculean it was to comprehend a single law. But Titania had apparently comprehended her third law. Her first and second, life and wood, were granted to her by the tree of life, or at least, that's what they all thought. It's not like they could ask the non-sentient tree. But this third law was something she had probably comprehended on her own. How did she do it? What did she encounter? Dodo thought. But he didn't ask those questions out loud. Instead, he opted to change the subject. Before you beat me to death with your talent, take a look. Dodo half turned his body and gestured to his sleeping wives surrounded by the mythical remnants of their activities. As you can see, I've been faring extremely well. I still have not learnt why this happens to us whenever we mate, and as you already know, the system refuses to provide answers, but it has truly been beneficial. Titania walked a few steps closer and peered at the sleeping women, but more specifically at the glowing spires of ice and metal shards. Because of it, the cultivation speed of me and my wives have increased by Beast King bounds. I am now a third-stage enlightened beast and my comprehension of the laws of water/ice has increased to 7%. Titania looked at him with her mouth parted in surprise. 7%? So quickly? She was flabbergasted. The increase in cultivation was definitely impressive, but she had already surpassed that level long ago, even if it was because of the long period Dodo had spent not cultivating, but hearing about the increase in law comprehension was almost like a slap to her face. She turned to his three wives, pointedly ignoring the copious amount of semen covering parts of their bodies and asked, "Them too?" She could sense how much their essence cultivation has increased for herself, and so the answer should have been obvious, but she felt like she had to hear the confirmation to believe it. Indeed, their comprehension of the laws has reached around 2 to 3%. Chica's has even reached 4%. Can you believe it? 4%. Although it's most likely due to our similar affinities, can you see how much of a genius my wife is? Haha, Dodo said with a shit-eating grin. Ah, sorry. Let me not brag too much. What about Alan, EY? I haven't heard about him in a while. What's his cultivation now? What about his law comprehension? Has it increased much? Ha 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 ha. Titania's eyes narrowed, but she ultimately chose to ignore the jab and shifted her gaze downwards where she could find the cause of all of this. Should I? Dodo saw where Titania's focus had shifted to and he immediately knew what was going through her head, causing his sleeping rod to stir. But he immediately put a stop to that train of thought and shook his head. Don't even think about it, he spoke with a tinsy bit of disappointment. You already know that it only works with my three wives. I highly doubt that that would change with you, regardless of how powerful you are. Titania's face twisted in distaste. I wasn't even considering it. I merely tried to see if my newfound strength would enable me to peer into the secrets of your penis. Dodo wryly smiled. He was pretty sure that she was lying, or at the very least, lying about not considering what they were both thinking of, but telling the truth about trying to appraise his penis. So, did you find anything? He asked with an innocent expression. No, she responded curtly. Really? Are you sure? He asked with mock seriousness. At that, she chose to ignore him, but her eyes narrowed in warning. Dodo suppressed a smirk. Whilst on the outside he looked honest, on the inside he was laughing goofily. Ahem, never mind that. So what has brought you all this way? Surely it's as serious as I'm imagining it to be. He decided to change the topic once more, but this time to the main one. Titania remained silent for a few more seconds as she continued to glare at him, but then her chest heaved and she let out a sigh. If what I am told is to be trusted, big trouble is about to strike not just this forest, and not even just this continent, but the entire world. Titania spoke grimly. What? Dodo asked awkwardly, thinking that Titania was making a lame joke. What kind of trouble could affect the entire world? And even if something like that existed, how could it possibly succeed with the heavens itself or whatever Sierra's father was, watching over the entire world? Titania should know this, so surely she's joking. Was she trying to get back at him? Actually, I heard all of this from Draco, who heard it from his big sister, who funnily enough heard it from the Western dragons. Dodo just stared at her as if she was talking about a mountain sprouting legs and running away. Seeing his obvious disbelief, Titania rolled her eyes. I'm telling the truth, Dodo. When have I ever made jokes like this? Dodo's heart began to beat faster, but still, he decided that he was going to take whatever she said with a grain of salt. So, what did they say? What's the problem? Apparently, 3 beings from another continent had arrived from the west where they encountered the dragons. 2 of them were in the 4th realm, with one of them actually being in the middle stages, but the 3rd being was just someone in the 3rd realm. Middle stages? Dodo asked in shock. Everybody knew how difficult cultivation became after the 4th realm. It could simply be expressed by the fact that the world's top geniuses had taken 127 years or less to get there, but in 45 years had barely scraped the 5th stage. Although Dodo didn't know how it was in other continents, he only knew of a handful of people that had reached that stage in this continent, so to hear of a foreigner that had reached the middle stages, 4, 5, 6, was quite astonishing. But still, this was certainly not helping Titania's claim of a supposed worldwide threat. What could a single middle-staged 4th realm being possibly accomplish alone? This continent alone had a few of them. The other 2 foreigners didn't even need to be mentioned. Yes, the 6th stage to be exact. Titania replied. Dodo shivered. In this continent, only Yorma the Devourer had reached the 6th stage. But rightfully so. The overpowered snake had too many reasons for power to naturally flow through her veins. She had even comprehended 2 different laws entirely on her own. Well, her earth laws were allegedly something that she had comprehended by studying her Eye of Petrification, but that I was effectively a part of her own body. It had become a part of her talent and no one could deny it. But even if that wasn't the case, it did not in any way dispute the fact that she had comprehended the laws of life without any assistance. Really and truly, in front of Yorma, nobody could compete. Except that apparently wasn't true anymore. How impressive could this foreigner be if they rival our continent's strongest, even if in only cultivation? Dodo thought with awe and slight fear. Who are they? He couldn't resist asking. You probably wouldn't believe it, but I think you, me and Sierra might actually know one of them. Titania said with a reminiscent smile. What? Who? Dodo asked, confused. Other than the goddess who he hadn't even met in person, he didn't know of anybody who had the potential to reach the 4th realm's 6th stage anytime soon. Not that he knew of the goddess cultivation, but she was a fallen goddess who had reclaimed a bit of her divinity. Her cultivation shouldn't be too far behind, and soon, she would be zooming past all of them. But other than her, he didn't know of anyone, talk less of a foreigner. Even Titania, with all her inheritance, intellect and access to the most special spring of life in existence, along with the tree of life that continued to reveal more and more surprises as time went by, was only in the 4th realm's 4th stage. A stage above him. According to her, this would have been different if there were better cultivation techniques for them to learn from, but to him, that was all speculation. They were pinnacle, first-generation geniuses, secret information provided by Sierra, and yet still, cultivating was too difficult. Would the so-called better techniques really help all that much? But he didn't care about all of that right now. He was far more interested in finding out the identity of the foreigner that they might have known in the past. Who could it be? Do you remember the day the world obtained magic? Titania asked. Dodo paled slightly. Once again, thanks to inside information from Sierra, they had realized that the 2 times that the world experienced apocalyptic changes were because it had evolved. He knew that the first time was because magic had been introduced to the world, or something like that, but nobody, not even Sierra, knew why the world had undergone a second evolution. What were the requirements? Perhaps an oversaturation of magical energy? He didn't know, and nor did he care much. But he very much remembered the details of both doomsday-like events. Of course I remember. He responded. Then surely you must remember the chicken. Titania said with a sparkling smile. Hearing that, Dodo's eyes warmed up with nostalgia. Ha. Of course. Till this day, that is the bravest chicken I know. Wait. Could it be him? I know that he achieved a strange evolution after jumping into the spring of life, and perhaps it provided him with enough talent to reach the 4th realm, but he is clearly not a foreigner. Oh? And so you know where he went after disappearing into that light? At that, Dodo couldn't reply. He remembered that after flying out of the spring of life, the chicken, but by then a more noble fire bird, had been swallowed by a giant beam of light that had descended from the sky, and then had vanished along with it. Did that light somehow transport him to another continent? That's what I thought. Titania continued. Of the 3 foreigners, one of them were told to look like a bird made from golden flames. That sounds nothing like that chicken. First of all, he was definitely made of flesh and blood, even after his evolution. He only became covered in flames not made from them. And on top of that, the flames were a regular reddish-orange color. Not gold. But I refuse to believe that you're stupid. What else do you know that makes you think that both of these people are one and the same? Titania smiled. Sure enough, there's something else. Dodo thought. The truth is that when they turned up at the Forest of Origins, those arrogant territorial dragons actually attacked them. Of course, at that time they didn't know what they were competing against and ended up dying, and as a result, a few of the supreme dragons were notified and it became quite bad. In fact, I heard that Mizali, the supreme dragon of water, almost died. And on the other side, although the third realm beast that came with the other 2 wasn't hurt in the slightest, Chad, the chicken, or rather Chad the king of phoenixes, paid a grievous price to protect her, almost dying in the process. He actually managed to survive the attacks of multiple supreme dragons. Dodo was starting to feel dizzy from the repeated shocks to his mind. By now, everybody knew that there was more to overall strength than just essence cultivation and anatomy cultivation. Species played a big part of it too. A Realm 4 rat, if that even existed, would never be able to defeat a Realm 4 dragon, even if it had the advantage of 3 to 4 stages. Most people just chalked it down to the difference in physical build, but some people thought it was more. However, a rough hierarchy of the most notable species on the continent had been established, and everyone believed that the dragon race was in the top 5. What had that chicken become that it was able to deal with multiple supreme dragons? Indeed, I heard that it is because of a special flame that his body hosts that allows him to heal from injuries, on top of the fact that the constitution of his body is very strange. I also heard that it didn't take long for him to reach full recovery after the fight despite his previous perilous situation. Wow, Dodo muttered in awe as he tried to picture the scenario in his mind. You said he became a phoenix? A phoenix king? Is that what he is now? Dodo continued. Something like that. I don't know the specifics. Titania replied. And you said that he hosts a special flame? Is it similar to the Dragon King's flame? An earth flame? Dodo's voice became a little tight at the end. Everybody knew about the earth flames, and they were about as coveted as the evil eyes. Even a regular spring of life couldn't compare in value. I don't know about that either. The information passed through many ears to get to mine, it's not like I could obtain every detail. Titania replied. However, I would say that it's very likely. I agree, but wait, the more you talk the less I believe that he's the chicken of back then. Quickly, tell me what you know. Dodo demanded impatiently. Titania rolled her eyes, but still began to speak. I heard that to stop the fight which kept on escalating, Chad started spouting out claims about world-encompassing danger and the need to hear him out. Only, the dragons were even more disbelieving than you were, and kept on attacking. It was only when he finally said that he knew of 2 powerful people from this continent that they began to halt their attacks. He described those people as a green humanoid woman and a deer animal with white fur and antlers of ice. He also said that he had found those people in the largest spring of life that he had ever seen, on the day of the first doomsday. Sound familiar? This, Dodo wryly smiled. Although he could still be someone else, if what you are saying is true then I cannot deny the strong possibility, Dodo said. But how did he end up in another continent? Titania softly shook her head. He said he doesn't know. Dodo sighed, but then thought of something. How did he know he was back on our continent? If he was truly whisked away, he shouldn't know how to fly or whatever back to this continent. Even if he got lucky and managed to find this one again, how did he know that it was the one that he came from? How did he know that we were definitely here? Good question. Titania said with a smile that Dodo reciprocated. Well, apparently, the dragons asked the similar questions, and the result was that when the foreigners had arrived on this continent, the system had congratulated the 2 that weren't Chad for finding a new continent. But instead of congratulating Chad, it had only said something along the lines of welcome back to the central continent. It has to be him. Dodo thought after a moment of silence. I'm glad we're on the same branch. Titania said with an even brighter smile. Now, would you like to hear about the things that he said? Of course, tell me everything. Dodo insisted. Great, because for the first time in the history of the continent, there's going to be a giant gathering that will include all the leading figures of the races that have fourth realm beings. Obviously, that includes you and I, so grab your so-called guardians of peace and let's go. Titania said. I'll be bringing my grand elders, Draco will be bringing his dragon lords, and Reiko will be bringing his kings and queens. Dodo's mind stalled as he processed the alarming information, but then his eyebrows rose as a thought struck him. Am I the last one to know about all of this? Obviously. Titania replied with a roll of her eyes. The dragon goddess told Yorma, Yorma told her brother Draco, Draco told his best friend Reiko, and they told me first because they're still somewhat scared of you. Unbelievable, Dodo muttered as he facepalmed himself. That incident was over 100 years old and yet those boys still held qualms about him. Where was the spirit of a predator beast? And wait, what do you mean by so-called? My guardians of peace are 100% legitimate and have never strayed from their purpose. Dodo said, feeling a little insulted. I just think that their names are a bit too grand for what they actually represent. Titania said with a snort. How so? Their purpose is to protect the peace of the rightful dwellers in my territory. Not too different from your grand elders, if I do say so myself. Do you not hear yourself? Titania said before turning around and walking back to where she came from. I would expect someone titled as a guardian of peace to be much like yourself, a powerful figure with mysterious powers, but most importantly a person who would protect anyone, regardless of the affiliation, if it were for a noble cause. Not just an elder, or grand elder for that matter. Dodo eyed her back with narrowing eyes. I do not protect everyone. Yes you do. Titania responded. What about Igneel and his followers? They deserved it. Barrow? Do I even need to reply? You should start preparing now. I'll be leaving with Draco and Reiko in 3 hours. You know the usual spot. If you're not there with your people, that's your loss. Leaves surrounded by mystical green light began to materialize around her body, swirling around her without any wind and emitting an intimidating aura. Wait! Dodo called out, causing her to pause where she was. What about the barbarians? She turned her head back to him and stared into his eyes, the glow from her own white eyes increasing with the mana she was stimulating within her body. What do you think? And then she disappeared, leaving a bunch of glowing leaves that eventually vanished into thin air. Dodo tilted his head up to the sky and sighed. East Continent, Yoloria Empire, outskirts of Alphonse Forest. Up above the sky, night had arrived and the moon shone brightly. It was a beautiful and peaceful sight. But on the land below, in the very outskirts of the Alphonse Forest where the trees met the giant mountain that separated it from the sea, there was no peace to be found. The leaves shook wildly as a horde of shadowy figures with red glowing eyes descended from the mountain and began to bound from branch to branch, making their way deeper into the forest. And at the head of these figures was what looked to be a man with malevolent eyes that were the brightest of all. He came to a stop on a rather big branch and lifted up his clenched fist to the side of his head, causing the other figures to also stop where they were. And as a result, now that they had stopped moving so swiftly, it quickly became apparent what they were. The human-like bodies, the unnaturally pale skin, the red irises and the aura of bloodthirstiness. Without a doubt, it was the blood fiends. And clearly, they were here on a mission. Ghost turned back to his people and raised his arms. My people, he began, using a concentration of mana into his larynx to increase the volume of his voice, but not so much that it would alert anybody else. With only the 300 people that he had brought with him today, it wasn't difficult. We are the almighty blood fiend race, a race so powerful that we once held an entire continent at the cusp of our fingers. Even the lord of all monsters that owned 4 demon king armaments had to take care when facing us. But as you all know, in recent years, we have suffered setback after setback and have finally fallen to this state. And do you know why? He paused for dramatic effect, but as expected, nobody was foolish enough to actually think that that was a window to speak. It is because of jealousy. Envy to be specific. But it's bigger than what you think. Has any of you ever asked why that abominable creature landed on our continent, and actually pondered instead of asking out of helpless rage? Have any of you ever genuinely wondered why envy came for us? Because I can tell you right now, it is not coincidence. The true reason is the jealousy of the beyond. Gasps rang out in response to the shocking words. Yes. The beyond that you fools idiotically worship. The faceless, bodiless entity that you imbeciles desperately beseeched to nurture our lands and enrich in our strengths. That is the cause of our downfall. I thought for a long time, and this is the only conclusion to the series of events that landed us in this situation. When you headless donkeys asked and asked and asked, begged and begged and begged, did you ever stop to think of what would happen to you when you gradually began to stop? When you forgot about the entity that must have gotten used to your senseless praisings and shifted your praises back to me, your true progenitor and creator? My people. The answer is very simple. The beyond is jealous and it wants us dead. Murmurs broke out at that, and there were even a few whimpers of fear. Silence, Ghost demanded, and instantly a deathly silence settled over the gathering. As you all know, the beyond is powerful beyond measure and isn't something we can defend against. But, for it to personally deal with us is a mockery towards itself. Why should it have to take care of insignificant beings like us, when it has other means? Ghost paused once more, but this time somebody actually took that moment to speak up. Sire, you can't mean, came the voice of a dark-haired fiend lord. It's exactly what you're thinking. Envy was sent by the beyond itself. That abnormal creature is not normal, and it never, ever was. It is not a beast or a monster that somehow rose to prominence through unnatural means, but instead something much, much more alarming. Ghost spoke, looking directly at certain individuals as he did so. It is the jealousy of the beyond incarnated. All of you here are the best of the fiend race and have all experienced the horrors of envy for yourselves. But even if you hadn't, you should all be very familiar with the feeling that the creature or any of its followers arose in us all whenever it got close. After all, it caused no shortage of rebellions that damaged us from within. But why is this so? Why is it that a beast could be so powerful that it could directly influence the concept of envy and jealousy itself? It is because it was never a beast. That creature that calls itself envy is quite literally envy itself. The envy of the beyond. And it wanted us dead. Ghost pseudo-roared, and then fell silent. But why are we not dead? He asked softly. We all know that for the past 10 years, envy has been more than powerful enough to wipe us all out, so why are we not dead? Why did it never appear when we were making our escape? Why did it not appear even when we had slaughtered some of its precious creatures in green? It is because, Ghost clenched his fists. The beyond has lost interest in us. After our countless years of pain, suffering and loss that had finally caused us to scurry out of our own continent, its anger has finally been appeased. We are free. Did you hear that? We are free. Free. No longer will we helplessly suffer the ire of that jealous entity anymore. We are unshackled beings and have the freedom to do anything. And with our newfound freedom, guess what we'll do? We will claim back all of our glory. Starting with this continent. Let's go. Ghost turned around and leaped to the next tree and then the next. Roar. Roar to your heart's content. Let the pitiful denizens of this forest know of our arrival. Let them fear and scurry away like rats as we once did. Let us wash away our shame. Re'ewa. Hissus. The blood's fiends roared, hissed and screamed with the rage, resentment and excitement that their progenitor's words had incited within them, following behind him without hesitation and making their way deeper into the forest. Tonight, the blood of many would spill. The leaves of the trees shook furiously as the horde jumped from one tree to another, announcing their presence without hiding and causing flying beasts to squawk as they evacuated into the sky, the beasts that could travel underground to burrow as quickly as they could, and the ones whose only option was to run didn't, to stampede with all their might without any hesitation. They could all feel the threat of the impending menace that was the blood fiends, even without the howling. However, before Ghost and the rest of the fiends could even get very far, a lone voice that relegated every other sound spoke out. The voice, regal and feminine, was like a pillar of holy light surrounded by demonic spires when compared to the malicious howling of the blood fiends, but it didn't seem to lose out in impact at all. Who? Ghost was completely shocked by the foreign voice. Someone he didn't know had managed to slip into the midst of him and all of his fiends, and none of them, not even he, had detected it? How was that possible? Could it be no? No. I refused to accept that I would stumble into another unfathomable enemy. It must be a trick, or some kind of special affinity or technique. But in the end, in front of overwhelming power there is nothing that petty tricks can accomplish. He had learned that lesson himself very well. Despite his tumultuous thoughts, his facial expression hadn't experienced a single change. After living such a hard life for nearly 200 years, he had long learned how to school his mannerisms when under pressure. No, especially when under pressure. He only allowed things like rage or shock to show on his expression when there was either no point in hiding it, or to provoke the people on the receiving end into doing or feeling something else. Only rarely did his mannerisms escape his control these days. I was wondering when you were going to come out. Finally had enough of hiding? He tilted his head up and spoke out loudly so that everybody in the vicinity, including the mysterious interloper, could hear. Obviously he was lying, but by saying this, he would dispel a portion of the fear and unease that his people were likely feeling, and make the unknown entity wary. With such great hiding skills she must be proud of it, and so by announcing that he had been aware of her presence all this time, it should definitely rattle her. Oh? The voice spoke out again, this time with a slight undertone of amusement. You knew I was here the entire time? She doesn't sound rattled. But she's probably pretending. Ghost thought with suspicion. Exactly. But to be honest, I find your ability to hide very impressive. You actually managed to deceive everyone here but me despite the fact that they are all my strongest followers. What a powerful skill. Ghost spoke with a smile. And so in light of this, I would like to offer to spare your life if you come here and teach it to me. The best lies were filled with truths. Ghost had learnt that too. The air was filled with silence and he knew he had her. I have one question. All amusement gone. What is it? Ghost asked, ignoring the excitement welling in his soul. Why are you looking above? When I am right in front of you? Ghost blanched in shock, before hurriedly trying to leap away. But it was too late. Before his feet could leave the ground a sudden very familiar pain struck him heavily. CSSSHHHH. Blood sprayed out from the gaping hole in his stomach. Ghost completed his leap backwards and landed on the floor, but the damage had already been done. The hole in his stomach that was about the width of an arm taunted him as it brought back memories of all the previous times that he had suffered the same injury, and a mixture of rage and fear cascaded him. After having barely survived the assault of envy and the weird blood tree in the South Continent, the one thing that scared him the most was power that he could not understand. The ability to attack him whilst not being detectable definitely classified as such, and on top of that, the attack just had to be similar to the one that had nearly destroyed him in the past. The one that constantly replayed in his mind over and over whenever he rested his head to sleep. It came as no surprise when he felt the increasingly familiar feeling of fear. But at the same time, he was furious. Bone-shakingly and hair-raisingly furious. Again and again and again and again and again. Why? Why must I suffer so much? Why must I always be met with such foes? All I ever wanted to do was eat. All I ever wanted was to become so powerful that nobody could deny me anymore. Is that so much to ask for? Why? Ghost gritted his teeth with anguish as madness began to sink his mind. Beyond. He roared out loud, no longer having the willingness to keep up the facade of control. Not that there was much need for it. Everybody had already seen the humiliating attack and knew that his bravado was a lie. Beyond. He roared out once more. Is this you again? Are you so useless that you cannot forget about a single mortal like me? Are you honestly that worthless? Why do you continue to torment me like this? Why? This beyond that you keep speaking about. Do you mind elaborating? Spoke out the female voice. Ghost's attention snapped to the branch that he had just been standing on, where, standing like an empress of the highest plane of existence, was the most beautiful female he had ever laid eyes on. In fact, she was so visually attractive that for a brief moment, the cloud of rage pulsing through his brain cleared and a feeling of utter bafflement clutched his mind. She had perfectly unblemished white skin, a potently feminine figure to tantalize all eyes, hair of literal light that spilled to her hips, irises that resembled the sun itself, a height of 190 or some centimeters, and an autocratic yet gentle demeanor that dazzled the senses. Her right hand was also covered by red liquid. What is that? How could a mortal look like that? Ghost thought. Wait. She isn't a mortal, is she? She must be another creature of the beyond sent to destroy me. The woman dropped her raised arm to her side and it was then that Ghost identified the red liquid coating the entirety of her lower arm and hand to be his blood. It dripped to the ground with perfect fluidity and pierced the silence of the atmosphere with each drop. Evidently, it was that very hand that was responsible for the hole in his stomach, and just like that, his rage returned with crackling vengeance. Ghastly creature that doesn't belong on this planet, die! Ghost roared, but although his cognitive abilities had seen much better days, he still wasn't foolish enough to challenge that creature alone. Fiends! The Beyond refuses to let us go and has sent us another challenge. But this time it is alone and cannot defend against the lot of us. Presented with this opportunity, let us show the Beyond exactly what we feel about it. Subdue her. Breed her. Torture her. Slaughter her. Ghost bellowed with all his might, infusing his larynx with so much mana that his voice traveled across the entire forest, including the city within. It was a small tactic that had the dual purposes of shocking his people into action and striking fear into the heart of his enemy, but although the former goal had successfully been achieved, the latter seemed to have completely failed. The sight of every crimson-eyed fiend converging onto the lone woman had to be an intimidating one, but she stood there undaunted, never looking away from his own eyes until the endless bodies in between them left no more room. The fear in his heart that had been suppressed by his rage jerked, threatening to break free from its imprisonment as the mounting undeniable facts leading to one truth threatened to dominate him into cowardice. But he refused. Gathering mana into his legs, he leapt straight towards the woman that he knew was still standing in the same place, thanks to his spirit sense, which he was now realizing had not helped him for a second when she was hiding. He ignored the bodies that were being battered to the side by his stunt, intending to use them to hide his own body till the very last moment, even if she was very well using the same spirit sense, and gathered the majority of his mana to his arms using a specific set of mana circuits that would have created a pattern if they were visible. But the concentration of mana increased the closer it got to his hands and was at the peak of concentration at his fingertips. This was the best ratio of mana distribution for his fighting style when he was going on the offensive, and the result caused his arms to glow red, his fingertips emitting red light like they had been replaced by carmine stars and almost vibrated with the power they withheld. Unlike other blood fiends, he had not been blessed by an element and had no affinity for them. He didn't even have an affinity for the blood element like the devils did. Of course, that was not to be confused with blood and blood essence. His affinity for those were perfect and unparalleled. But that affinity only assisted him in the siphoning of the power they held, meaning that if a human or other life form that had no affinity with blood essence tried to absorb it, they could probably only harness 5% of it, whereas he, with his perfect affinity, would obtain the entire 100%. Something that had resulted in his rise to the 7th stage of the 4th realm. However, that did not disprove the fact that he could not shoot lightning bolts or fireballs like those with elements. It was a pity, but other than the times that he wasn't trying to forcefully change that through his many experiments, he didn't dwell too much on it. Instead, he focused on perfecting his martial arts. Martial arts that this woman was about to hold the full brunt of. Ghost finally made his way through the sea of bodies and caught sight of the abnormal woman once more, her eyes boring into his own as if she had not lost sight of him the entire time. But things were not as he had expected. For starters, there were an additional 8 humans that appeared around her, materializing into existence at the same time that his spirit sense picked them up and staring into the sea of blood fiends with noticeable wariness but even more courage. Obviously, they had been using the same technique that the strange woman was using, but the other even scarier alternative was that rather than them all using the same technique, it was that strange woman that was extending her own ability to hide to others, and only now chose to reveal them. However, although Ghost gave this matter surface-level considerations, he didn't care to ponder any deeper. All he desired in this moment was for the blood of his foes to drench his body and for the rest of their body parts to become the materials for his next creation, whether it was 1 foe or 9. The rage flowing through his veins wouldn't be satisfied by anything else. Besides, those pitiful humans, even if they were a strange variant called high humans that had managed to reach the illustrious 4th realm, were still only at the 1st stage. He couldn't detect much from their obvious leader even now, but he could tell that she was much stronger, probably in the 7th stage like him, maybe even the 8th or 9th. But each and every one of those extras were in the bona fide 1st stage. Utter trash. Perhaps they would be able to make waves elsewhere, but here, where he had with him fiend lords that had reached higher stages like the 3rd and even the 4th, they would only become the nourishment that would enrich the powers of his people. Slaughter! Ghost roared out as a crimson aura flared around, enhancing the color of his red hair and completely red eyes. Slaughter! The fiends echoed back, striking terror into the residents of the forest. They descended onto the large branch where the high humans awaited, the branch being big enough to safely withstand about 20 people, and heads immediately began to fly. Unfortunately, they were not the heads that he wanted. These heads held red eyes that were frozen in shock, not the golden or other eye colors of his enemies. His blood fiends were somehow already dying, and it was even in such a quick and effortless manner. How? Ghost inwardly growled, his rage and frustration climbing even further. He was losing control of everything and nothing made sense anymore. The blood fiends that had just died were only in the 1st stage, but that was still no excuse for that appalling display. They were fighting humans. To die in such a fashion was not only a disgrace, but it was also supposed to be impossible. A blood fiend versus a human was like a lion versus a rabbit. If they had even roughly the same cultivation, a human would always suffer defeat. But what was this situation? What was he seeing? A disgrace. A disgrace of the ages. However, infuriated to the skies and back that he was, his battle instincts honed by over 100 years of merciless warfare refused to allow his rage to cloud the fact that for such a reality-bending sight to happen, there had to be a cause, and he had to be extremely wary of it. Perhaps high humans had more innate capabilities than just talent in cultivation. Did they have divine strength? Perhaps sharp retractable claws that could take off heads in a single moment? He soon found out that the answer to those questions was no. The real reason appeared the glowing weapons constructed from mana that were being wielded by their owners to separate his blood fiends into multiple pieces, leaving trails of light in the air and humming with power as they went. What is that? Ghost questioned with astonishment. But he didn't have much time to think any further. His body had finally arrived at the branch, and if he didn't want his own head to fly, he better start fighting. Sending a bit more mana into his legs, he bounded forwards once more and instantly arrived in front of one of the humans, this one being a tall male that had blue hair and dark eyes. The color of his aura and by proxy his mana was a vivid blue color and carried the distinct nature of water affinity. The weapon he carried was a thin sword of the exact same color and was easily identifiable as a masterful concentration of water elemental essence. But unfortunately for him, Ghost wasn't at all like those beheaded blood fiends, and there was nothing that could save him from death. His clawed hand struck out with mind-boggling speed and created its own trail of red lights that tore through the air with malevolent viciousness. Only, before it could meet its intended target, a flash of golden light zapped through his peripheral vision, and suddenly instead of striking flesh he was striking the flat side of a golden sword. This one much wider than the last and humming with power that was completely incomparable. Naturally, it belonged to the newest bane of his life. However, he didn't get shocked, and his instincts drove him to instantly strike out with his other hand with an even greater speed, aiming at the location that he had subconsciously calculated the owner of the sword to be, based on the position and trajectory of the sword. This experience was something that he had gained thanks to his numerous clashes with demon kings that wielded all sorts of weapons, with the clashes against the Lord of all monsters being the most enlightening. Whoosh! Unexpectedly, he failed to hit his target once more, his old target having been displaced in a manner that he expectedly failed to understand. But now that things had slowed down a few ticks, he used that moment to actually focus on what he was striking at and caught the sight of the woman bringing her upper body back to a vertical position. He quickly understood that she had dodged by leaning backwards and decided to push further whilst her balance was still disturbed. But in the back of his mind his mood was only continuing to drop. Body at full throttle and savagely swiped at the woman with his claws. And at last, his attack made contact with flesh, ripping open her chest and spewing blood into the air. However, for some reason, unlike regular blood, her blood seemed to have a slight golden undertone. But Ghost wasn't surprised. In fact, he would have been surprised if her blood was normal. After all the great figures he had seen in the past had blood like this, with the only difference being the color. Azura's blood had a black undertone, Envy's blood had a green undertone, although much more noticeable than the undertone of the others, and his own blood had a brighter red undertone. He didn't know the cause, but it seemed to be a hallmark of extremely powerful figures, which this woman obviously was. But if he didn't care too much to think about it back then, he certainly wasn't interested in thinking about it now. He swiped out with his other arm, taking pleasure in the ever so slightly widened eyes of the woman who he was sure was suppressing outward emotions, and even more pleasure in the blood coating his fingers. Had to get another hit in. He needed more blood. Biz! With a flash of golden light the woman disappeared and reappeared a few steps back, and in the same moment, two of those high humans that weren't fending off other blood fiends dashed forwards with their weapons and thrusted towards him. However, he wasn't the same fool that he was many years ago. He would never forget the day he had laughed at Azura for trying to attack him with all four of his weapons from over 20 meters away, thinking that he had gone mad from frustration, but it was that moment of carelessness that almost caused him to be destroyed by the following crescent lights. Useless! He roared, leaping towards the figure on the right and striking down with a heavy blow. But at the last second, he changed the trajectory of his attack and swung towards the right of the high human's back where he suspected the woman to appear. She obviously didn't want her people to die, so she would definitely try to save this one. Unfortunately, although he had the right idea, his estimations were a little off. The woman appeared to the left side of her subordinate, a little in between the man and him, and slashed down with her sword of light with a speed that he simply couldn't bring his body to react to. Like that, he lost his entire arm. Thanks to his unparalleled innate regeneration abilities, the hole in his stomach had been close to closing. But now his arm was gone, and even if he wasn't in the middle of a fight and focused his energy on regenerating it, it would still take a good few minutes to get it back. Despair threatened to breach his heart, but he shoved it back, instead allowing the rage that was already occupying his heart to overflow. From the beginning of this fight, he had always known that it was pretty much hopeless. Talk less of her ridiculous ability to hide and her obvious affinity with the rare and illustrious light element, her speed was just too much. Speed had been the very thing that he had primarily relied on to retain his life against foes like Azura and Envy. Both of them could easily release powerful attacks that could rearrange the constitution of his body if the attacks landed, so if he wanted his lifespan to remain intact then he better get out of the way as soon as possible, and it was when he was at a safe distance that he could begin to use his words if all else failed him. But this woman was so fast that he could barely see her move. Talk less of dodging her attacks. Every of her attacks so far, even if just two, had managed to hit him and damage him severely. Against this woman he could not defend himself. But looking at the emotionless eyes that gazed at him as if he were a nobody, and looking, with his spirit sense, at the growing number of blood fiends that had suddenly decided to flee, knowing very well that he would not be enjoying the luxury of leaving this place to deal with them, something in his head went off. Something in his head snapped. Erg! Feeling utter hate churning through his veins like a tangible liquid, he roared to the skies with unadulterated wrath. His vision warped to red and many things in his brain began to shut down as fury sparked across his skin like an electric current, leaving only thoughts of anger and slaughter. From the beginning, he had always been oppressed, always been the underdog, and always been the weak one. There was always someone there to crush his wants and desires. Always. First it was the chief of his tribe back when he was a human. His desires had been as simple back then as his situation. All he wanted was food, enough food to fill the belly, and that was all. But no. He was always denied. So driven by madness almost like the one he was feeling now. He killed that man and drank his blood, causing him to become the blood fiend that he was today. Later, when he thought he was finally free to do as he wished without having to be afraid of being punished, the Lord of all monsters struck terror across the entire continent and he was once again living life on the edge, his desire to be the strongest a thing he could only dream about. Later, when he gave up the dream of being the strongest individual and found more promise in the strength of the masses, he desired the conquest of the continent and made many sacrifices to make that happen, doing his best to even get the foolish monsters under his banner. But like clockwork, the Phoenix of Envy arrived and his desires were dashed. Here he was again, dreaming of claiming back the power that the blood fiend race had once held, and perhaps obtaining more, hoping that things would be better this time. He had left that accursed continent, right? Things can't be the same, right? Right? But no. 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 Like clockwork, another being had appeared to dash away his dream. Ghost roared again, stumbling backwards as wrath and anguish flooded his soul. Beyond. 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 Ghost inwardly screeched as blood began to drip out of his eyes like crimson tears. Why do you hate me so? Ghost chaotically gripped his own face, uncaring of the damage that his sharp claws were causing to his skin and flesh as he continued to stumble backwards. At this point, it didn't even matter anymore because even if he was afraid of pain, which he was not, he was no longer capable of feeling his own body. All he could feel was the terrible heat of rage, so much heat that it felt like he was being roasted alive. But more than that, even his 4 other senses were beginning to malfunction. Every sound, other than the heartbeats of the people in the vicinity including his own, had faded to near nothing. His vision had lost every color other than red and blurred at the edges, but he could see the blood-pumping blood vessels of the various lifeforms surrounding him with a clarity that he had never experienced before. Even the beating shape of their hearts beneath their skin had become visible. He could smell it too. As a matter of fact, he couldn't smell anything other than their blood, and that too with an unprecedented clarity. It was completely abnormal. His body was changing in a way that he didn't understand and it should have been frightening. But all he could feel, was rage. Blood poured out of the wounds that he had just torn open on his face, neck and chest. But they healed nearly instantly as a dark red aura, unlike his previous bright crimson aura, began to leak out of his skin like a semi-tangible light, radiating a feeling of such calamity and hate that it caused those in the vicinity to feel like their end had come. "I will slaughter you all," Ghost roared before pouncing forward. Or at least, that's what he tried to do. For some reason, only his head had moved, and it was spinning around and around, causing his vision to swim. Huh? Gloria stood a few meters away from the beheaded creature, feeling a little flabbergasted by what she had witnessed. Not too long ago, the man had roared to the skies before asking why something called the Beyond hated him, and then all of a sudden, a terrible feeling had struck her heart, and before she knew it, the clouds had been dispersed by the arrival of a strange dark red construction that resembled a symbol of sorts. That symbol had radiated such a malevolent feeling that for the third time in her life she had felt pure fear. In its presence, she couldn't even move, so she was barely able to prevent herself from dropping to her knees, talk less of assisting Victor, the Alphonse King, and his knights. So all she could do was watch as the blood fiend that she had priorly judged as intelligent and cunning, descended into madness as he screamed and screamed, seemingly ignorant of the giant symbol above his head. This continued for a short time as the symbol seemed to be gathering energy from distances she could not see the end of, and then it decreased in size and slowly sank into the strange creature's forehead before disappearing. This abruptly freed her and her people from its horrible influence, much to her relief, but that was not the case for everyone else. Suddenly, a replica of the symbol had been engraved on a majority of the blood fiends' foreheads, and they began to howl like mindless and furious beasts, their eyes glowing even brighter than before. However, they never moved. They stood still and stared blankly into space as if they had fallen asleep standing. And in that moment, she knew what she was looking at. Previously, when a green aura of envy had encompassed the world, followed by the black aura of hunger, it had caused a few of the people in her populace to fall into a trance before experiencing abnormal changes that all resulted in them being put on her KOS, kill on sight, list. Clearly, this was happening for a third time. And she had no doubt that if she were to return to her empire, there would be another set of her citizens that she would need to add to her KOS list. Which of course, she didn't want. So she made a rapid and rather reckless decision considering the circumstances, and calculated the risks. It was then that the man burst out with a baleful aura that carried the properties of the symbol that had merged with him, saying that he would slaughter them all, proving that his senses were gradually returning to him. So she knew that she had to act quickly. Hence, without hesitation, she utilized the greatest movement technique in her arsenal to appear in front of the man, knowing that he had to be disorientated from his recent changes, and used her strongest and quickest attack technique to separate his head from his body, followed by his limbs, effectively cutting him into 6 pieces. Like that, the leader of the so-called blood fiends had died. Each of his pieces lifelessly fell to the ground and rolled in different directions, with a few of them even falling off the branch of the giant tree, but it was the face of the head that was frozen in shock that held her attention. Today, her eyes had been opened. She had always known about the phenomena of the colored emotions, but she did not know how they had come to be. Now, she knew. Of course, she didn't know the specifics, but going by the prior course of event, it seemed that certain people were chosen by a colored emotion to become its host, and their ascension would cause beings all over the world to fall into its thrall if they lacked a certain amount of willpower. How interesting. System. Is there a way I can make use of this? Gloria asked, but there was no response. In the past, Gloria had been able to make use of the system to obtain the things that she sought, but sometimes, actually most of the time, she would be met with silence like this. But she wasn't mad. Thinking of the gravity of what the body of a host of colored emotion could mean, she knew that the chances of the system providing any information were extremely low. To expect it to give answers would be foolish. However, she was not deterred. She fully intended to study the body of the host and obtain its secrets. Perhaps she could learn how to influence the minds of others the way a colored emotion can, or at least its ability to share its power with others. But just as she moved forward to gather the 6 separated body parts, they very suddenly began to glow with a dark and ominous red light. Currently, Eridel's avatar was floating in the sky above the North Continent, having a conversation with living storm cloud, Cleo. There were some things that he wanted to make sure were put into motion before he finally met up with his self-proclaimed daughter, Sierra. However, that was of course, not all he was doing. He was paying attention to many things at the same time, and the turbulent events in the East Continent were certainly one of them. The ascension of the Sin of Wrath was something that he had always expected, so although it had managed to disturb Cleo even all this distance away, it had been nothing to him. But contrary to the relief of Cleo, when the ascension process had come to an abrupt end, he was shocked. His brow creased and his smiling lips melted into a frown. "Well, this is quite the predicament," Eridel muttered. "What's wrong, Jonas?" came an innocent androgynous voice. Eridel shook his head. The death of a sin could result in some pretty disastrous results if not dealt with properly. But obviously, the residents of the planet weren't advanced enough that they knew how to correctly deal with such things. So for a moment, Eridel was tempted to deal with it himself. But in the end he decided not to. This would be an important lesson for the world. And as for ghost dying? Well, although it was sad for such a talented figure to die, it didn't mean too much. Especially since dealing with resentful spirits was another thing that the world hadn't learnt to do. The resentful spirit formed by the ex-host of Wrath was definitely going to be a force to be reckoned with. Eridel wouldn't be surprised if the entire resentful spirit stage was skipped and ghost became, well, a ghost. A true ghost. Eridel sighed. "Nothing's wrong, Cleo." He looked at the gigantic cloud that rolled about as lightning coursed through its entire body. It was truly an amazing sight to behold. "So, are you ready to become one with the heavens? Run!" Gloria shouted out before flashing towards the two slowest people in her group, grabbing them by their necks and flashing away again. The others also didn't dare to slack and immediately followed after their empress with their greatest speeds. Naturally, the fiends below that hadn't been incapacitated fled as soon as they grasped the situation. In any case, everything had already fallen apart. Their progenitor had died and they were surrounded by death. The only option they had was to flee as quickly as possible if they wanted to live to see another day. However, although they all shared the desire to escape the imminent danger that they were sensing from their progenitor's corpse, they did not share the capability to achieve such. The fiend lords and those that were close to that level managed to run far enough, but before the others knew it, a loud explosion sounded out and everything faded to black. They had died without resistance. But whilst they had fallen into darkness forever, those that had managed to survive could only see an endless crimson. Dark red light flooded the forest and even spilled out of it like a tsunami, and the pressure that it released was so haunting that a number of weaker creatures that didn't die from the explosion ended up dying from fear. But that was not the end. For a few of those that were enshrouded by the dark red light, nothing really happened. They felt fear and worried for their lives, but ultimately, that was all. They had a willpower that was stronger than others. But those that had a weaker will, and that was the majority, beasts and enlightened races alike, but especially beasts, ending up being infiltrated by the dark red light. In other words, the essence of wrath seeped into their bodies without restraint. Which of course, resulted in some rather drastic changes. A lot of them died, but those that didn't directly skip the follower of wrath stage and directly became something akin to envies, creatures in green, gaining random features that signified their attunement with wrath like dark red skin or fur, dark red eyes, dark red horns, dark red hair, etc. In a single moment, creatures all over the southern region of the East continent had become creatures in red, a few of the blood fiends and even a couple of the fiend lords that thought they had escaped included. Outside of that, the number of followers of wrath across the world had increased dramatically. Now, at this moment, that wasn't that much of a problem. The followers of wrath and creatures in red barely knew how to use their newfound powers, talk less of knowing how to cultivate it. So at most, they only gained a sizable boost to all of their current powers. And more than that, thanks to the innate qualities of the essence of wrath, many of the beings that had been afflicted had lost their minds to endless anger, attacking anything in sight without finesse regardless of the power level of their target and dying as a result. However, this would eventually change. Many of the followers of wrath, especially the creatures in red, would begin to adapt to the new essence coursing through their veins. They would begin to find the best ways to utilize their wrath, learn how to prevent it from taking over their minds and even how to use it to damage the minds of others. Eventually, they would become a very serious problem, much more problematic than the other sin followers that weren't under the direct control of their sin source. Central Continent, West Forest, Dragon Mountain. The dragon goddess had claimed the highest peak of the 15 dragon peaks for herself, everybody knew that. But what they didn't know was that 9 other peaks had also changed owners. But once provided with such information, it didn't take much to guess which 9 figures were so special that they had taken the homes of 9 supreme dragons. Without a doubt, it was the 9 dragons of destruction. When the dragon goddess had claimed the highest peak for herself, she had taken the 9 dragons of destruction along with her despite their nature, which could be considered anathema to her own. Normally, a creature of creation and a creature of destruction would never be able to coexist in harmony, even if the laws that they represented were as interlocked with each other as yin and yang. However, there were always outliers, and the relationship between the dragon goddess of creation and 9 dragons of destruction were one of them. Gaia adored her 9 destructive siblings, especially the calm as lake Calmilla and ferocious as fire Eshma, and she always treated them well. Eshma had grown over the years and wasn't as reckless as he used to be, thanks to the careful guidance of Gaia herself alongside the continuous association with his twin sister Calmilla. And if things continued to go like this, then there was no doubt that Eshma would become a powerful and respectable dragon that bore a fierce loyalty to the dragon goddess that had taken care of him. But as it seemed, boom, fate had other plans for him. A great mass of dark red light descended from the sky and flooded into the second peak's cave with the force of a great avalanche, and before the giant sleeping dragon within could even react, his crimson-scaled body had already been infiltrated. Eshma woke up with a frightened roar as the malevolent energy violently thrashed throughout his body, attacking his mind and causing his thoughts to blur. But as the knowledgeable would expect, there wasn't much that it could do to resist as the essence of wrath began to make changes to his body. His size, which was already 80 meters long, began to swell, his muscles beneath the scales increasing in density and efficiency in horrific fashion. On top of that, the area around his wings bulged about grotesquely as if something was growing underneath. This also occurred on his tail and the sides of his head, and it was very strange to look at. Soon enough, the roars of fright began to warp into deep bellows of rage. Gore! Chaotic lights of dark red, representing wrath essence, and bright red, representing destruction essence, swirled around the mutating dragon in a violent manner. The transformation was so chaotic and blinding that it looked like the dragon was undergoing the worst level of cultivation deviation, which meant that instead of becoming an abomination, he was directly going to blow up. However, that didn't seem to be happening. Though, in situations like these, one could never be certain. But in any case, the commotion that this caused did not go unnoticed. Yelled words and roars could be heard from outside the cave, and they were increasing in number, but ultimately, there was nothing they could accomplish. The chaotic energy within the cave prevented them from entering if they wanted their lives to remain intact, and the dragon they were trying to call the attention of had long lost the ability to hear, talk less of respond. Currently, Eshma was screaming with agony and stimulated rage as the mutation no evolution, this could no longer be called a mere mutation, began to enter the next stage. His scales began to drop off, something that was already a painful experience, but soon enough, his reverse scale was also going to peel off, and when that happened, the word pain would not be enough to describe it. And if the tears, shaking eyes and whines of terror were anything to go by, the dragon knew it. However, before his scales could finish the process of falling off, the bulging things beneath his skin finally revealed themselves. Shick! Eshma's flesh and skin were shredded as a second pair of wings erupted from his back, causing his current roar of pain to spike in intensity as shock and pain flooded his nerves. This second pair of wings were smaller in size and completely lacked scales unlike the first, although that was quickly changing, but they were still impressive to look at. Unfortunately, before Eshma could adjust to the new additions to his body, a second pair of horns erupted from the sides of his skull, black and surrounded by swirling red lights like the first pair of horns, joined by a row of spikes that matched the design of his horns appearing all over his tail. Eshma's scream, which had previously been sheer and desperate, had been abruptly cut off. Because the scream that he had attempted to achieve in that moment was not something that his throat was willing to withstand. But anybody who looked at the crazed pupils that were constricted to the point that they nearly disappeared would know that the pain Eshma was feeling was not something they could imagine, and his reverse scale had not even fallen off yet. Looking at the blood that was leaking out of the new additions to his body as if they were foreign objects that had pierced through his flesh to appear where they were, one might even pass out of fear. But on the topic of those injuries, it had to be said that they were quite unnatural, because whilst it wasn't uncommon for some evolutions to cause one to go crazy with pain, they were rarely ever this violent. This mostly occurred when a person tried to reject an evolution/mutation with all of their will. It provoked the evolution to be a bit more forceful with its transgressions if it wanted to succeed, and oftentimes caused a lot of injury. But the worst-case scenario would be for everything to go haywire, causing the recipient of the evolution/mutation to die or become an abomination. That would be quite bad. But whether that would happen to Eshma or not was yet to be known. In the meantime, it was better to focus on the dragon's mana core, where the essence of wrath had finally come into contact with the essence of destruction. Things were about to become troublesome. TSSSSSSSSS. As soon as the two essences came together, a loud sizzling sound broke out into the air with deafening force. It was as if somebody had put two different volatile solutions together and they were about to detonate. The essence of wrath besieged the mana core with the violence that was innate to its nature, but it was definitely not prepared for the appearance of the equally violent, if not more so, essence of destruction. The essence of destruction immediately put up a fierce defense and the two essences ended up in a fierce struggle, much to Eshma's misfortune. The pain he was experiencing was just too much. The feeling of the two violent energies fighting it out in his mana core and mana circuits caused him to feel as if his life was coming to an end. "I'm about to die," he thought, but not with words. The assault that his mind was enduring didn't allow him to form any. What he was feeling was something akin to a free fall. He was falling down from the sky without wings, and any moment now he would collide with the ground and die without resistance. Absolutely horrible. As helplessness descended over him like a heavy blanket, his last few thoughts before everything turned black was a desperate yearning for help. The distorted faces of Gaia and Calmilla disintegrating into nothingness. Meanwhile, on the outside of Eshma's cave, an assortment of dragons were hovering in the air as they tried their best to observe what was happening inside. All shapes, sizes, and colors could be seen, however, despite the domineering sight that they collectively provided, the mood was clearly one filled with dread. They had all heard those harrowing screams before they had fallen silent. That alone was enough to shock them, but to know that those shrill, terror-filled screams had belonged to Eshma, the hegemonic and dauntless Eshma? Their blood had long chilled. What kind of unspeakable things was the strongest dragon of destruction experiencing that it could force those kinds of noises out of him? At the head of them all was of course the golden goddess, Gaia, but she was the most worried of them all. Ignorance was bliss and the wise were burdened. She knew that everything occurring inside of that cave was the doing of the new third sin and that no matter what happened, whether Eshma survived or not, he would not be the same little brother that she knew. For some reason the new sin had managed to thoroughly sink its claws into Eshma. Before now, it had been pretty obvious knowledge that those who were enthralled by the sins were those with weak wills or those with excessive affinity with the specific sin. However, even in the latter case, those with strong wills were easily able to shrug off the enthrallment of the sins. Eshma, the arrogant dragon of destruction, should have been more than capable. But what was the situation? If those screams were filled with any more horror, even the gods of death and darkness would be shifting their feet. This situation was clearly unique, that could not be refuted. But Gaia was not the littlest bit happy. Quite the opposite. Whatever this new sin was, it did not work like the others. The effect it had on people was too sinister. Unlike the prior two, which would at least allow an individual to retain their mind, even if they did undergo a personality shift, this new sin caused those that it had enthralled to go completely crazy. Most of them were a few steps away from mindlessness, and the only thing they wanted to do was kill. They had no regard for the strengths of their opponents and attacked without any hesitation. Disregarding the abnormal abilities that they seemed to gain as an exchange, the ruthless mantra that this third sin represented was not something she wanted anywhere near the already temperamental Eshma. It had taken her years to teach him how to control his innate rage, but now, it looked like all of that effort was about to be destroyed. 2 minutes later, the dual energies within the cave flared even higher as they entangled even more, causing the dragons watching from the outside to put even more distance in between themselves and the cave. But then all of a sudden, the voice that had fallen silent long ago suddenly squealed out loud with such force and ferocity that they all knew his throat was ruined. That unholy sound was not something that could be produced without sacrifice. But more than that, each and every one of them felt an instinctive tingling on that one special scale beneath their necks, their one and only reverse scale. It was such an odd feeling that caused them to feel repulsed, but it didn't take them long to figure out why. A few of them felt a shiver run down their spine. Eshma's reverse scale had been brutalized. They didn't know how or why, but they could instinctively feel it. For some reason, the more powerful a dragon became, the more in tune they were with their fellow brethren, but it had never reached the extent that they could feel each other's suffering. But thinking about it, it could be that the pain that Eshma was feeling was so high that it met some kind of requirement, or perhaps the mutation or evolution that Eshma was clearly undergoing had caused him to have a higher connection with other dragons. Something that surpassed even their connection with the goddess. What a ridiculous evolution. Having known that of the two energies they were sensing, one of them belonged to Eshma. It didn't take much to guess that something was happening to his mana. But it was only when his reverse scale had been savaged that they knew he was gaining a full-body makeover. But still, a number of them had felt the pain over shedding scales, including the reverse scale. But it had never caused them to make that kind of sound. Suddenly, the energy within started to recede. It was over. However, before they could let their guard down, their great goddess yelled out, "Retreat!" And then she flew off extremely quickly, almost becoming a golden streak in the air. And so, not daring to disobey, they all flew after her. However, some of them still yearned to learn of what had occurred to Eshma, and intentionally slowed down their speed whilst looking back. That would be the last mistake they made. Boom! A gigantic explosion erupted from the cave, releasing a wave of crimson-red energy that was so nefarious in nature that it actually began to slowly erode the ambient magical energy. Not enough to make any significant kind of effect, but enough that if that energy was constantly released into one place, with enough time, that place would definitely be ruined. And that was even despite the innate defenses of the planet. So what would happen when that kind of energy came into contact with ordinary life forms? The answer was provided very quickly. All of the dragons who didn't get out of the range of the explosion on time were swiftly dealt with a hefty amount of damage, but that was the least of their troubles, because they were soon besieged by the malevolent energy and within a few seconds their bodies began to erode. Fear and agony clawed at their hearts as they tried their best to purge the heinous energy out of their systems, but their ordinary mana simply could not combat the newly combined essence of wrath and destruction. A mere 47 seconds and they had all died with half of their bodies destroyed, open flesh and even bones exposed. But it didn't end there. Their bodies naturally fell out of the sky and crashed into the heavenly dragon mountain, beginning a long journey to the bottom that would certainly reduce what was left of them to paste, but before that could even happen, the destructive essence continued to claim the rest of their bodies, only coming to a stop when the only thing left of their bodies were a bunch of very damaged bones and a few scales. All of this was watched by the remaining dragons in the air, and they were very frightened. None of those dragons that had died were weaker than the fourth realm. Although none of them were supreme dragons or even elder dragons, they were still in the fourth realm. And yet, they had died so quickly, and in such a gruesome manner too. What on Iridius was the meaning of this? Gaia's eyes narrowed as she watched the pitiful remains trickle down the mountain. This was beyond her expectations. Naturally, having watched the evolution process for quite some time, she had already suspected that there was a possibility of neither the essence of destruction or the essence of the ruthless sin winning over the other, and consequently reaching a state where they either disappeared together, or fused together. Obviously, the latter scenario is what had occurred, creating an energy so vicious that its mere existence eroded the things around it. It wasn't hard for Gaia to observe what was happening to the ambient magical energy. For such a thing to occur, Gaia let out a long sigh. It had to be known that energy was immaterial, it could be absorbed, it could be expelled, or it can even change states and forms, but there weren't many things in existence that could cause it to be directly destroyed, even if slowly. Such things were extremely rare to see and weren't too inferior when compared to the laws of chaos, an existence that was even more incomprehensible, but Eshma had obtained this power. However, at what cost? Having 100% affinity with the laws of destruction, his personality had always been one that was concentrated around brutality. He had an innate desire to ruin all things, something that his twin sister also had despite her calm nature, and it had taken him a very long time to learn how to act civilized. The only reason his twin sister had always been able to remain peaceful was because her comprehension of destruction imitated the sea. The sea had many states and calm was one of them. On the other hand, Eshma's comprehension of destruction imitated fire. Fire was a chaotic force that was always raging and destroyed everything it touched. Fire had no peace. Although Eshma being a complete sapient life form with infinite capacity to learn prevented him from being a slaughter machine, it was still quite impressive that he had learned to associate with his brethren, even forming selfless bonds with certain individuals. But now, there was a new, equally vicious energy that his body was hosting, something that had fused with his laws of destruction to form something new, and that new energy had thoroughly integrated itself into his body, down to his very DNA, by riding the waves of an evolution. There was absolutely no way that he would remain the same. And as if to announce that, a roar that could only be labeled as hell-raising exploded out of the cave. It was a roar that sounded both sharp and deep, courtesy of its multi-layered effect, but none of that information was enough to convey the amount of horror that it had inflicted on every life form that could hear save for Gaia. Every one of them, including the Crystal Dragon King, felt terror clutching at their hearts with a death-like grip as the roar continued to go on, increasing in volume, depth and ruthlessness as it did so. It was as if they were insignificant rabbits in front of a mighty yet hungry apex predator and there was nowhere to escape. They had only felt this kind of feeling from two people before, Gaia and Yorma, the two existences on the continent closest to the title of Kaiser, but now, all of a sudden, there was a third. Everybody remained silent as the knowledge of what this meant sunk in, and their fear only continued to grow. Normally, having another supreme existence in one's race was a thing of great joy. This should have certified their race as the rulers of the continent without contest, however. There was one more thing about the roar they were hearing and the aura that was accompanying it. And that was that it was by far the most evilest thing they had ever experienced. Gaia and Yorma's auras and roars induced similar levels of fear, but that was just instinctual fear to the mighty. But not only did Eshma's roar induce the same feeling, it also made them feel as if they were in front of a being who wanted them to suffer, rather than just die. Whatever had happened to Eshma, he was now 100x times worse, not 100x better. Suddenly, a dark red blur flashed out of the cave entrance and ascended into the air at an unfathomable speed, but they weren't so stupid that they would be oblivious to its identity. Of course they knew it was Eshma. However, although they now feared him, they were curious about his new appearance. Would he gain new dazzling scales? Would he change colors? A longer and more flexible tail? Spikes? Serrated teeth? Sun-like eyes? Or even an elemental body like those two weird phoenixes? Clearly his evolution was a pinnacle one, so what would it look like? They were not prepared for the sight of 6 crimson eyes, an extra pair of horns, an extra pair of wings and even an extra pair of legs. No other dragon with such abnormal features had appeared before. The spikes trailing down his back and tail were more normal, including his much bigger size and the completely different scales that were an interesting mixture of dark and light red colors that shimmered as he moved, almost like a chameleon but much more interesting, but that was where the normalities ended. 4 horns, 4 wings, 6 legs and 6 eyes? What was the meaning of this? Had his evolution been inspired by a spider? Had he somehow gotten his hands on the evolutionary blood beast technique? The illustrious technique that allowed a beast to steal the genes of another? Impossible. 172 years had passed and there were many cases of beasts using the evolutionary blood beast technique, causing it to be well known. But even if it wasn't as famous as it was, the dragons would definitely still have known of it. After all, it was because of this very technique that those false dragons in the East exist. However, although the technique was definitely amazing, they quickly wrote it off as the cause of Eshma's new form. It was really impossible, for a multitude of reasons too. But first and most important of all was that dragons could not use it. Their goddess had told them that it was because they were the perfect species and didn't need to steal other genes, which they could definitely understand, but some of them were still envious. It was truly a great technique. But more than that, even if Eshma did get his hands on the technique, there was no way they could use it. All great techniques had many limitations and this one wasn't exempt. Since they didn't possess the technique themselves, they didn't know all the information, but from what they did know, there were 2 restrictions that prevented Eshma from using the technique even if he did have it. And that was the incompatibility between a dragon like him and something like a spider, and the apparent fact that the technique could only be used when breaking through the magic beast realm, Realm 1, to the spirit beast realm, Realm 2. It had to be known that not all beasts would evolve because of a breakthrough, normally they would only get bigger and stronger. Evolutions were a special phenomenon that only occurred rarely, and that was putting it nicely, but the evolutionary blood beast technique triggered it every time. Of course, the technique could only be used once. It wasn't possible to break through to the spirit beast realm over and over, but once was definitely enough. Eshma was far above the spirit realm, so it was really and truly impossible for him to have any relations to that technique. However, his evolution was just that astonishing. But wait. Something suddenly dawned on them. Something that Gaia had already been worrying about for some time now. Before all of this, Eshma had been close to the peak of the 3rd realm, the 8th or 9th stage to be a bit more specific, so this evolution, no matter its cause, should have been tied to his breakthrough to the next realm. However, in such cases, the 3 tribulations lights were supposed to strike first. Sometimes an evolution and a tribulation could occur at the same time, but that was only when an irregular evolution or mutation triggered an upgrade in strength that pushed them over the threshold of the fourth realm, instead of them getting a normal upgrade in power, causing the evolution and the tribulation to take place at the same time. Very similar to what was happening to Eshma. But there was not a single tribulation light to be found at all. What was the meaning of this? On top of that, everybody knew that after each evolution to the fourth realm, they would be compelled, almost forced into taking the form of their enlightened body. Very few people could resist this compulsion, but why do so? An enlightened form was something to take pride in, why ignore it? It didn't make sense. The Crystal Dragon King looked at Eshma, whose aura seemed to still be growing, and a thought crossed his mind. Could it be? His eyes constricted into thin lines and his heart jumped. Has Eshma not yet entered the fourth realm? It was just as he was thinking this that Eshma let out another horror-inflicting roar. His aura, which had been growing steadily, began to fluctuate as its growing speed jumped by many times, his 6 completely red eyes that looked like they were about to leak blood glowing even brighter than before. At the same time, a cloud so impossibly white that it could have only been formed by the heavens began to materialize in the sky above Eshma's body, and at the center of this cloud was a very, very familiar circular formation. The Tribulation Circle. Never in their wildest dreams could they have predicted that Eshma had not yet entered the fourth realm, but was about to do so now, which would grant him another massive increase in strength. Apparently, he was not finished growing. The tribulation cloud and circle greatly expand, revealing it to be none other than a white tribulation, causing great waves of shock to crash through their hearts. Previously, only Gaia had received a white tribulation from the very first light. Even Yorma's white tribulation had only started from the second, not the first, essentially, a sequence of gold white. Did this mean that Eshma and their goddess were on the same level? Eshma gave a rebellious roar at the tribulation. It was a sound that was so incredibly soaked in fury that the bystanders even wondered if he had something personal against it, but that was all. Even he didn't dare to attack it. Nobody did. They had all learnt their lesson. The tribulation didn't act beyond expectations, and after 9 pulses and 3 strikes, Eshma had been reduced to a steaming mess, his body barely managing to stay on its 6 feet. However, even then, he continued to stare at the sky with his 6 bloody eyes as if it had murdered his entire family and desecrated their graves. Really and truly, Eshma had become a mad dragon. There was no other way to explain his behavior. But even though they probably shouldn't be anticipating the following growth that every tribulation survivor was rewarded, considering what it meant for someone like that to grow stronger, they couldn't help it. How much further could this mad dragon grow? The air of expectation was extremely dense as every dragon watched transfixed. This is it, they thought. They could feel the surrounding magical energy converging into Eshma's body like a slowly growing tsunami that was coming from all directions. They felt like they were watching the birth of a legend, and the awe they were involuntarily feeling wasn't in any way inferior to that of the awe they experienced when they were watching the divinity reclamation of their goddess. So other than Eshma's blood-curdling growls, it was extremely silent. And as the surrounding magical energy continued to gather, the tension in the air only increased. Some of them even began to sweat. It was just too exciting. However, a smaller but growing group of them consisting of the more intelligent minds were wondering why it was taking so much magical energy and why it was taking so much time. Normally, the breakthrough to the fourth realm occurred almost immediately after the tribulation, sometimes taking up to 10 to 15 seconds if the person was really, really talented, but it had been 40 seconds now. Was Eshma really that terrifying? They didn't know, but they shivered at the thought. Finally, after half a minute more of waiting, they heard it. The sound of a pop. It was barely audible and they could hardly hear it, some of them even felt like they imagined it. But without fail, they all felt that the time had come. The tension had broken and the terrifying tsunami was about to crash. Hush! Eshma let out his most dignified roar, yet as magical essence flooded his system, and what happened next caused quite an amount of eyes to boggle. Eshma grew. Nothing special at face value, after all, he was entering the fourth realm. Of course he was growing, but it was the speed at which he was growing that was simply ridiculous. Their eyes follow him with astonishment, going up and up and up just to keep track of him. And soon enough, they began to realize why his breakthrough had taken over a minute to gather all the magical energy needed. Eshma was not becoming an enlightened beast. He was becoming a celestial beast. What? Huh? Impossible. This dash. How? Sounds and words of astonishment broke into the air as the gravity of the situation dawned on them. A celestial beast? Seriously? The crystal dragon thought with shock. He was completely and utterly flabbergasted. Till date, he had only heard of two celestial beasts, Apis the celestial elephant and Jungo the celestial monkey king. He was sure there weren't any more of them on the continent because such gigantic beings weren't the kind of creatures that could just hide if they wanted to. Apis, being an innately tall elephant, was 500+ meters tall as a celestial beast, whereas Jungo, a monkey that was of course smaller than an elephant, was 400+ meters tall. But 400 meters tall was still a terrifying height and wasn't something that an ordinary enlightened beast that averaged on 70 to 100 meters tall could compete with. But more than that, celestial beasts had mysterious powers that nobody had enough information on, so even without their daunting size, they were still insufferably imposing. And now, Eshma was about to become one of them? Even with the ridiculous abilities he already had? The crystal dragon king gritted his teeth. Dragons were much bigger than elephants, so how big would Eshma become as a celestial beast? Wait, forget that, he had just finished an evolution but now he was already undergoing another one. What kind of abnormal creature was this? For the first time in his life, the crystal dragon king felt insignificant. When Gaia had surpassed his strength, he had taken it as a matter of course. Gaia was a goddess, the goddess of creation itself to be exact. From the beginning she had been far above him in strength. It was only that she had received a dastardly injury that caused her to have to slowly regain her strength from scratch. Eshma on the other hand was a regular mortal like him, who on top of that had only entered the fold of the dragons when he was already in the fourth realm. But now, look at the situation. It truly made one feel worthless. Going back to the source of attention, Eshma was still growing with seemingly no end in sight, but there were some new additions. Mainly, the forming of the celestial runes, the supernatural runes that were customary to every celestial beast. Most of the people here had seen them before, as the upper echelons of one of the strongest races in the continent. They had all made at least one visit to the celestial desert where Apis ruled and another to the jungle of gold where Jungo ruled. They had seen the celestial beasts in the flesh, and they both had the mind-twisting runes that their eyes found uncomfortable to look at, some of them feeling much more than discomfort when they actually attempted to comprehend them. Eshma was gaining these too. Bright red runes that looked like they were made from divine light slowly appeared over his body. However, as jealous as the bystanders were, they could tell that he was once again in a world of extreme pain. After that first heaven-challenging roar, he seemed to be doing better, standing steadily on his feet as he glared at the sky with hatred as he soaked up all of the magical energy. But as soon as those runes began to appear, he directly crumpled to the ground without a single sound. Only his head seemed to be barely resisting as he, for some reason, tried to glare at the sky once more. But any moment no. Dumb. Eshma's massive head fell to the ground. Aha, yes, as expected, he passed out. He actually passed out from the pain. The spectating dragons were still spellbound and didn't even realize that Eshma had passed out until a few seconds later, but before they could fully recover and think of what to do next, a sea of destruction wrath essence emerged from Eshma's body and formed what looked like a cocoon around him. It happened in an instant and there was nothing they could do about it. The energy quickly became solid and compact, and even without testing it, they could just tell that trying to breach that cocoon would require Herculean effort that they weren't quite sure they were capable of using. So just like that, silence was once more returned to the 15 peaks. None of the dragons spoke. The awe and fear in their hearts was gradually fading, but there was still enough to leave them dazed, staring at Eshma's growing cocoon stupidly as if they had mental issues. Each and every one of them had their own thoughts about the situation and they felt like something had to be done, but ultimately, none of them felt qualified enough to make judgments about the situation. So one by one, they turned their heads to their spiritual figure. Gaia, the goddess of creation itself. In all this time, Gaia had not made a single sound. She had only watched the events unfold as if they meant nothing to her, but thinking about it, that's how it should be, right? No matter how crazy Eshma becomes, he's still immortal. How can anything he can accomplish amount to anything in front of a primordial goddess like Gaia? These were the thoughts running through their minds, and as they continued to watch the indifferent face of Gaia, some of them let out a breath of relief whilst others actually began to feel more confident. But no matter their reaction, they all simultaneously thought that no matter what happened, their goddess would protect them. Their goddess would guide them. Everything was okay. The faith that they had in Gaia grew and they all secretly prayed for her well-being, hoping that she could quickly regain her past strength and lead them to glory. Our goddess, some of them thought with zeal in their eyes as they gazed at the dragon with scales of brilliant gold. Contrary to their thoughts, Gaia was quite worried. Once again, ignorance was bliss and the wise were burdened. The laws of destruction were not in the slightest inferior to creation, in fact, its battle potential was actually greater. But she had been able to suppress Eshma and the others because of her knowledge, her greater experience with cultivation, her techniques, and the helpful fact that beasts, especially young beasts, were very willing to obey the strong. Thankfully, that wasn't something that was different to other worlds. But now, Eshma had gained a significant increase in power and his essence now consisted of two extremely powerful laws. She didn't know if what the sins were could be considered a law, but they were definitely on the same level. Considering this, even if Eshma had not gone mad, how could he be so willing to obey every word of Gaia like before? Yes, she was a goddess, yes, her techniques still gave her a much greater edge, and yes, her position in his heart should have caused him to submit, but Eshma was no longer the Eshma of before. She would be surprised if he didn't attack everything in sight as soon as he woke up. The pure unadulterated rage she had sensed from him was only matched by eldritch abominations that possessed a hatred for everything in existence, including themselves. Such hatred was not sane. The introduction of that new sin in Eshma's body had made him much stronger, so strong that it was unbelievable, but it had ruined him. She wholeheartedly believed that. So this begged the question, what was she going to do about it? She obviously could not ignore such a dangerous threat, so she had to think of a solution. She had been thinking for quite some time now and she had a few ideas, but she had not made a decision. After all, in a situation like this, she did not want to make a mistake. So, the first and most painful idea was to simply kill Eshma as soon as the cocoon was removed. As the age-old adage goes, prevention is better than cure. Perhaps it was the wiser choice to completely remove the threat that was Eshma, rather than leaving him alive to grow even more powerful than he was now. But she did not want to do that. She had spent a lot of time with the dragon and she had grown quite fond of him. Plus, what would others think of her if she were to so easily give up on one of her strongest followers just because he stepped into the deep end? At the very least, she should be given a more acceptable reason. No need to kill him as soon as he arose from his evolution. However, she didn't bury the idea. If she sensed something that could really endanger her and her people if he was left alive for even a minute longer, she would deal with him. Another idea was to somehow get him to learn a special mental technique that would help him control himself. It was a really good technique that she used herself called the 9 Pillars of Heart Fire. Its uses were many and it could even help to enhance the soul itself, but it was very difficult to learn. That was one reason that she hadn't shared the technique with others, but the main one was purely because she didn't feel the need. It was a very special technique and what was treasured should be kept secret. On top of that, what if some powerful figure like the one known as Eridel traced back the special techniques that she handed out to her and decided to read or heavens forbid, devour her soul? Soul-devouring techniques were so rare that even she, as old as she was, had never seen one and had only heard of them. Usually, the only thing that could devour souls were spirits and special beasts, but she hadn't heard of them being able to steal information from their soul-devouring, so aiming for her for information would be useless. However, spinning this back, she now slightly regretted having not taught the techniques to at least the destruction dragons, as risky as it was. Her last and final idea was to enslave his soul. As an immortal who had lived for many, many years, she possessed an array of techniques that she used to consider evil when she was an insignificant mortal. Soul enslavement was one of them.